Darkness. A single crown glints beneath candlelight, heavy, sacred, and stained. They say history remembers kings, but what it truly remembers are the women they broke. 6 queens, 6 vows, 6 prayers that ended in blood. He called it destiny. They called it love, and the church called it divine. But in the silence, after the fire, only their names remained, whispered through stone halls and shadowed tapestries. This is not the story of a king. It is the confession of 6 women who turned a throne into a tomb and love into legend. He broke a church for love, and 6 women paid the price. If their story still haunts you, if their courage still burns in your blood, then keep their fire alive. Like, share, subscribe, because history only lives when we dare to remember the women it tried to erase. The cathedral breathes with light. Morning spills through the stained glass of Westminster like liquid gold, breaking across marble and bone. The scent of beeswax and incense clings to the air, sweet and suffocating. Beneath the vaulted ribs of stone, 1,000 souls bow as one. At the altar's heart stands a boy king draped in crimson. The crown of England, heavy with jewels and blood, waits on a velvet cushion before him. His hands tremble, not with fear, but with the weight of eternity. Henry Tudor, the second of his name, has just inherited the dream of a dynasty built on conquest and prophecy. Outside the abbey, bells scream across London. The Thames flashes like steel beneath the morning sun, ships rocking in reverence. But inside, the noise is only heartbeats and the whisper of prayers that no one dares to finish. Henry closes his eyes. He feels the stone floor beneath his knees, the cold bite of destiny pressing through the silk of his robes. The archbishop's hand hovers above him, blessing, burden, and verdict in one. The crown will descend, the boy will vanish, the king will rise, and above him, in the shimmering glass, Christ's figure looms crucified, serene, eternal. The moment stretches. In that stillness, something ancient passes between heaven and man. The promise of a kingdom, the hunger for an heir, the price of a soul. The crown lowers. Metal meets flesh. The congregation exhales. And the new King Henry VIII opens his eyes. They are not the eyes of a boy. They are the eyes of a man who believes God is watching and approving. In the galleries, courtiers exchange glances like daggers. They see not a king of mercy, but one of magnitude, youth gilded with arrogance, beauty touched by will. He smiles, and the world shifts to please him. Among the sea of silk and candlelight stands a woman, dark-haired, Spanish, serene, Catherine of Aragon, the princess who crossed oceans for alliance and faith. Her gaze is steady, her lips barely curved in reverence. In her presence, Henry imagines righteousness. She is devotion made flesh, and he the vessel of divine order. It will take years for him to realize that both their gods demand different sacrifices. The choir rises. The Latin hymns roll through the rafters like thunder muffled by prayer. Henry feels invincible. The very stones seem to tremble with his heartbeat. He believes he will rule like Solomon wise, beloved, eternal. He believes he will sire sons who will build a heaven on English soil. He believes love and faith will obey his command. He does not yet understand that belief is the first sin of kings. The coronation feast ignites like a storm. By midday, the palace is a furnace of gold and wine. Musicians flood the halls with triumph. Servants stumble beneath the weight of platters and goblets. Outside, Londoners gather to cheer, throwing flowers into the air like prayers turned visible. Inside, beneath banners stitched with the Tudor rose, Henry's laughter shakes the walls. He drinks to his father's ghost, to his mother's memory, to his own reflection in the polished silver of the chalice. The taste of power is new like blood and honey mixed on the tongue. Catherine sits beside him, smiling as custom requires. Her hands, pale and deliberate, trace the rim of her goblet. The rings catch the light, each one a promise made by men and broken by God. She knows the dance of kings, She was married once before, to Henry's dead brother. And now the church has blessed this second bond, calling it holy. Holy. The word hovers like smoke. She watches her husband's face, his flush of youth, the spark of danger beneath charm. She sees the world as he does not. The hungry eyes at court, the priests who whisper treason disguised as devotion, the shadow of Rome stretching across every prayer. Catherine has faith, but faith is not the same as trust. Night falls like a benediction. The torches burn low. London sleeps beneath a new crown. In the royal chambers, Henry stands alone before a mirror. His crown rests on the table beside him, its reflection distorted in the glass. The silence is thick, the kind that arrives after applause dies. He studies his own face, too young for the lines that will come, too certain for the doubts that will devour him. Behind him, tapestries of saints and martyrs flicker in candlelight, their stitched eyes watching, their flames frozen. He touches the edge of the crown, then the cross around his neck. Two symbols, two gods, one mortal, one eternal. Somewhere in the dark, a storm gathers over the channel. At dawn, Henry rides out to the fields beyond the city. The dew clings to the grass like tears. His horse's breath curls in the morning air. He looks back once, the towers of Westminster pale against the horizon, and feels something rise in his chest that he cannot name. Not fear, not joy, something deeper. A hunger that will never be sated. The wind moves through the fields, bending the wheat as though bowing before him. In his mind, he sees it already a realm united. His name an empire, his sons carrying his blood into eternity. He does not yet know that the first son will die before drawing breath. He does not yet know that the next will be a daughter, and that her eyes will be her mother's filled with fire and prophecy. He does not yet know that every woman he loves will bring him closer to the God he will one day betray. For now, the morning is his, the crown is his, the kingdom is his. And so, beneath the rising sun of June, the story begins not of a nation, but of 6 women who will define its soul. To history, it will be called a reign. To the church, a heresy. To the women who loved him, a curse. But for now, it is only a promise shining, young and doomed. A crown resting on a head that believes itself eternal. A cross waiting to remind him otherwise. Night descends upon London like a velvet shroud. The city exhales after a day of celebration, the markets emptied, the taverns spent, the bells silenced at last. Yet within the palace, the air still quivers with music long vanished. Candles burn low, bending in their own smoke, as if exhausted by reverence. The great hall is deserted now, tables overturned by feasting stand like fallen altars. The scent of wine and wax hangs heavy, mingled with the faint iron tang of spilled blood from roasted meats. Above, the banners droop, their bright colors muted by shadow Tudor red, fading into the darkness. Somewhere deep in the palace, the king does not sleep. Henry walks alone through the corridors, his footsteps echoing like heartbeats against stone. The torchlight flickers over his face, young, unscarred, but already marked by something older than ambition. Power has a scent, and he has begun to wear it. He moves past portraits of dead Tudors, his father, stern and pale, his mother, ghost-like beneath her crown. They watch him from their frames, painted prayers that cannot speak. Their eyes follow as he passes. He feels them like judgment pressing on his spine. In a small chapel at the end of the corridor, a single candle still burns. Henry enters. The air is cold, sacred. Shadows crawl along the walls like living things. He kneels again, not as king, but as man before the golden crucifix. Outside, the storm that had been building all day breaks open. Rain lashes the windows. Thunder cracks above the Thames. For a moment, lightning floods the chapel, and the cross gleams as if aflame. Henry flinches, then straightens. To others it would be fear. To him, it is revelation. He believes it is a sign that heaven itself has acknowledged his crown. But the candle sputters. Wax spills down the altar, pooling like blood. The flame wavers and dies, leaving the room in sudden darkness. For the first time, the new king feels something cold brush the back of his neck, not wind, not shadow, but something that lingers. He rises and turns. The chapel is empty, yet in the reflection of the crucifix's gold, the faint image of a woman's silhouette shimmers slender, veiled, unblinking. Then the lightning fades, and she is gone. The next morning, the city wakes to rain. The bells ring again, not in celebration, but in ritual mass for the new reign. The river swells, muddy and restless. Fishermen whisper that the storm was an omen, that the heavens had wept at the crowning of another Tudor. At court, no one dares to speak of such things. Catherine of Aragon, now Queen of England, moves through the corridors with measured grace. Her gown, heavy with pearls, trails behind her like the wake of a ship crossing dangerous waters. She has been raised to see storms as tests of faith. Every shadow is a scripture, every silence a sermon. She prays for her husband's soul and for her own endurance. Henry, meanwhile, stands before a window in his chambers, watching the river churn. The world below feels small, the city nothing but veins pulsing toward his throne. He tells himself, this is the beginning of order, the dawn of a divine empire. But beneath the surface of his certainty, something stirs a whisper he cannot name, a hunger that no crown can silence. It begins as the simplest thought, a son to carry his name, his blood, his kingdom. A son to prove that God favors him above all kings. A son to make the world believe what he already does, that his rule is sacred, not mortal. And in that thought, history shifts. Weeks pass. Summer ripens. England blooms beneath its new monarch. Tournaments blaze across the fields. Hymns echo through every chapel, and the court becomes a theater of splendor. But behind the pageantry, the first cracks begin to form hairline fractures in the marble of a man's faith. Catherine prays daily in the chapel, where the candle once died. She feels peace there, though she cannot explain why. Sometimes, when she kneels, she senses a presence beside her, something soft, watching, patient. She thinks it is her guardian angel. It is not. It is the future, waiting. In another part of the palace, the royal painters work to immortalize the new couple, the king, radiant in armor, the queen serene in her crimson gown. On the easel, their faces glow beneath the artist's brush, symbols of divine union. But the artist's hand trembles, for he knows what the court will not yet speak. The queen is with child. Word spreads like wildfire through London's narrow streets. Bells ring again, this time with unbridled hope. England holds its breath. Henry rides daily to the chapel, kneeling before the altar, whispering to the unseen heavens, "Let it be a boy." He imagines the child already strong, golden-haired, a mirror of himself. The boy will be England reborn. The boy will secure the line. The boy will make God proud. But when the day comes, the bells do not ring. The child, a boy, breathes once and no more. The city falls silent. The palace shutters its windows. The mother weeps in solitude, while the father walks the halls like a phantom wrapped in gold. Henry stares at the crucifix again, but this time there is no lightning, no sign. Only the dull reflection of a man who cannot accept loss. He tells himself it is a test of faith. But in his heart, faith begins to fracture. Autumn arrives, and with it, a creeping cold. Henry retreats deeper into ceremony, masses, hunts, feasts, each one grander, emptier than the last. Catherine grows quieter, her eyes darkened by grief. She prays harder, fasts longer, believes more, yet no miracle comes. And one night, as the king stands before his mirror once more, he sees the faintest shimmer behind him, a shape, a woman's figure, indistinct but real, not Catherine, not any living soul. When he turns, the room is empty, but the reflection lingers, just long enough for him to recognize the outline of another face, one he has not yet met. Dark eyes, a sharp jaw, a crown of black hair. Anne Boleyn, The vision fades like breath on glass. The candle that died in the chapel never burns again. The wax has hardened into a scar upon the altar, untouched, uncleaned, unforgotten. Priests avoid it, claiming superstition, but the servants whisper otherwise. They say that on stormy nights, when thunder rolls over the Thames, the wax glows faintly red, as if remembering the blood that will come. Years later, when the kingdom fractures and the heads begin to fall, they will look back to this day, this coronation, this storm, and say the signs were always there. A crown too heavy, a prayer too proud, a man too certain that God was his reflection. But for now, history sleeps, dreaming of 6 names: Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine, Catherine. 6 candles unlit, waiting in the dark. 6 prayers unanswered. 6 fates woven into the crown that gleamed beneath the thunder. Spain, a kingdom of stone and fire, where incense burns thicker than air and saints outnumber kings. It begins here, not in England, but under the blinding gold of Castile's Sunday. Catherine was born into faith, as others are born into breath. Her mother, Isabella the Catholic, knelt upon cold marble floors, her knees bloodied from prayer. Her father, Ferdinand, ruled with sword and scripture. Between them stood the child, their youngest, a girl destined for alliance, not freedom. From the first days of her schooling, Catherine was told that she belonged to God first, and to England second. Her tutors whispered of destiny, of divine marriage, of kingdoms joined not by love but by covenant. Every lesson was a preparation for exile. She grew beneath cathedral shadows, her days marked by bells. She learned Latin from priests, politics from courtiers, and silence from her mother. When the Queen of Castile prayed, the court would kneel in perfect stillness. Even the air seemed to still itself, waiting for God to listen. Catherine learned then that holiness was not peace, but endurance. By 15, she was engaged to Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne. The betrothal was written in ink and blood. The papal blessing sealed it. England and Spain, bound by faith and fear. When she left Spain, the sea was cruel. The waves rose like walls. The ship groaned beneath the storm, and the sky rained salt and omen. Yet she never wept. Her rosary beads never left her hands. Even as lightning struck the mast, she whispered prayers into the wind, believing each word would be carried to God across the tempest. She arrived in England, pale and trembling, wrapped in Spanish silk that clung to her skin like armor. The land smelled of mud, wet hay, and foreignness. The people stared at a girl from the south, copper-haired, eyes like amber glass, crossing herself in a language they did not understand. They called her the Spanish princess, but in her heart she remained a daughter of Castile, bound by the vow of a faith that demanded sacrifice. Arthur's castle was damp, more tomb than palace. The walls wept in winter. The air carried sickness. He was kind to her, this frail boy prince, but kindness cannot fight destiny. Within months, fever swept through the court, and the sound of bells returned not in celebration, but in mourning. When Arthur died, England fell silent. Catherine's crown dissolved before it was placed. At 16, she became a widow in a foreign land. No longer a bride, not yet a queen, a ghost between 2 kingdoms. They left her to wait. Years of waiting in cold chambers, with unpaid servants, living off letters and prayers. Her father delayed her dowry. The English court grew restless. Some said she was cursed. Others said she was blessed. But she never wavered. She prayed. She studied. She endured. In the long silence between wars and negotiations, she found comfort in the words of saints who had suffered more. Patience, she once wrote in her private psalter, is the armor of the faithful. When Henry ascended the throne, young, radiant, full of promise, she was already half forgotten by the court. Yet the wheel of politics turned again, and with it, her fortune. The new king looked upon her not as the widow of his brother, but as the solution to a fragile alliance. A papal dispensation was granted. The church, ever obedient to power, declared her free to marry again. and so she became Queen of England not by passion, but by providence. Their wedding was quiet, almost humble, though London rejoiced with the desperation of a city hungry for joy. When Catherine entered Westminster Abbey, she wore gold brocade sewn with pomegranate emblems, her mother's symbol of faith and fertility. The scent of frankincense filled the nave. She bowed before the altar, and for a moment believed she had fulfilled her divine purpose. The crown pressed against her brow, heavy, eternal. The same candle that had burned for Henry's coronation flickered again that day and again went out. For a time, peace reigned. England prospered under her calm rule. She presided over courtly life with quiet dignity, her Spanish composure mistaken for coldness. But beneath that stillness lay a woman of fierce intellect and deeper faith. She was not a queen of vanity. Her power came from endurance. When Henry rode to war, she governed in his absence, signing decrees with a hand both delicate and unwavering. When ambassadors from Spain arrived, they found her fluent in politics, sharper than most men who surrounded the king. Yet all that England saw, all that Henry desired, was a son. In the early years, hope burned bright. The queen bore him a child, a boy, and for a single night, joy rang through the palace. Bells, laughter, hymns. But by morning, the child was dead. She buried her grief beneath velvet veils and prayer. When Henry came to her side, she smiled with the serenity of saints, whispering not of sorrow, but of faith. And so it continued, one stillbirth, one infant lost, one fragile girl who lived. Mary, the court murmured. The king prayed, then questioned, then turned away. Catherine did not complain. She prayed harder. She fasted. She whispered to God that she would give him her life if only he would give her husband peace. The years passed. The light between them dimmed. She aged quietly while he grew restless. The queen became a relic of virtue in a court that had grown addicted to youth. Around her, laughter grew louder, jewels brighter, feasts longer. But the queen's chambers remained the same, lit by candlelight, scented with myrrh, guarded by silence. She prayed each night for her husband's soul, unaware that outside her door, new faces watched her with envy and ambition. One among them, young, dark-eyed, and unafraid, lingered longer than the rest. Anne Boleyn. The name would one day echo like a curse, but now it was only a whisper behind silken fans. In the final years of their marriage, Catherine's letters became confessions. To her confessor in Spain, she wrote of loneliness not as despair, but as devotion, that her suffering was the will of God, the fire by which faith is proved. She believed still that Henry loved her, even as distance hollowed their vows. When ambassadors warned her of the king's wandering heart, she answered not in anger, but in pity. "He is my husband," she wrote, "and what is his sin, if not my cross?" The court shifted like a tide. The women grew younger, the gowns more daring, the talk more dangerous. Catherine's Spanish sobriety seemed out of place among English laughter, but her faith did not waver. It only grew heavier, like a chain worn too long. Ach mas, she knelt, until her knees bleed. Each dawn, she rose to face a man she no longer recognized. Each night, she dreamed of a son who never came a child, who would have saved them both. And in those dreams, the candle burned again, the one that had died on the altar years ago. This time, it burned with steady light, neither bright nor dim, as if waiting for its final act. The queen prayed before it, her lips trembling with faith too strong to be reasoned with. But in the shadows behind her, the air began to shift. The whisper of silk, the scent of rose oil, the presence of another woman. The future had entered the room, and with it, the end of her reign. The silence came first. Not anger, not betrayal, just silence, that long, echoing pause when love has turned into memory. Henry no longer came to her chambers. His footsteps, once familiar in the echo of stone corridors, faded like a prayer unanswered. When she sent for him, he was occupied. When she wrote, he had not the time. In his stead came rumors, the cruel kind that wears truth like perfume. Anne Boleyn now wore the jewels once gifted to Catherine. Her laughter followed the king through halls where the queen's voice no longer mattered. And at court, they began to whisper, not of her majesty, but of his majesty's conscience. It began as doctrine, or so Henry claimed. He asked whether it was lawful in God's eyes to have taken his brother's widow as wife. He quoted Leviticus with the fervor of a man seeking permission for sin. He said he feared for his soul, that his lack of a male heir was divine punishment. But Catherine knew the question was not born of Scripture, but of desire. The Pope himself had once blessed their union. Now Henry sought to undo that blessing, to unmake what heaven had sealed. The court divided like a wound. Cardinals, ambassadors, and lawyers debated the Queen's virtue as though faith were a ledger and marriage a contract. Pamphlets spread through London. Sermons thundered from pulpits. All of England became a confessional. Catherine did not flinch. When they summoned her before the tribunal at Blackfriars, she entered not as a defendant, but as a queen who still believed God was watching. The hall was vast, its air heavy with incense and judgment. Henry sat on a raised dais, the weight of the crown pressing deeper with each passing moment. Around him, bishops and nobles murmured like a congregation awaiting sacrifice. Catherine moved slowly to the center, a woman no longer young, her Spanish dignity now a kind of armor. When asked to kneel, she remained standing. She did not plead. She did not accuse. She simply declared that she had been a true wife, that her marriage had been lawful, and that her conscience was clear before God. And when they asked her to swear that her union with Arthur had been unconsummated, she looked upon them all men who had never known her prayers, her grief, her nights of blood and loss, and said nothing. Her silence was her final act of sovereignty. Henry rose that day no longer a husband, but a king convinced of divine exception. He turned from Rome, from the Pope, from every altar that had bound him. The Church of England was born not from faith, but from the hunger of a man who could not bear to hear the word no. He called it reformation. She called it betrayal. They took everything from her. Her title stripped, her servants dismissed, her letters censored. She was sent away from court, first to the moor, then to Kimbleton, a lonely manor surrounded by fog and fields that smelled of decay. The Queen of England became a prisoner of piety. Her rooms were bare, her meals meager, yet each morning she rose as if still in a palace. She dressed as a queen, prayed as a queen, and signed her name Catherine the Queen by the grace of God. For the rest of her life, she refused to acknowledge any other title. She would not yield to politics, nor to time. Even when her daughter Mary was forbidden to see her, she did not curse her husband. Instead, she prayed for him, for his soul, for his blindness, for the mercy he would never earn. Winter settled upon Kimbleton like penance. The stone corridors breathed cold into her lungs. Her hands trembled when she wrote, but her letters remained firm, each word inked in devotion and restraint. She wrote to the emperor, her nephew, not of vengeance, but of faith. She wrote to Mary of patience, of courage, of obedience to God above all men. She wrote to Henry of forgiveness. When word reached her that Anne Boleyn had been crowned, she did not speak. When she learned that the new queen had given birth not to a son, but a daughter, she knelt and prayed for the child. It was mercy beyond measure, the mercy of a saint or a fool. Her health began to fail. Slowly, at first a cough, a fever, the ache of too many cold winters. By the time the snow fell again, she could no longer stand without help. Still, she insisted the chapel be prepared each morning. Still, she knelt before the crucifix. Still, she whispered Henry's name among her prayers. The candle beside her bed burned low one January night in 1536. Outside, frost clung to the windows like lace. Inside, she lay still, her hands folded over the rosary she had carried from Spain. Her final breath came not as sorrow, but as surrender, a soft exhale that seemed almost like relief. In the morning, her women found her surrounded by calm. The air itself felt holy. A letter lay upon the table addressed to Henry. No accusation, no plea, only words of love forgiveness, and blessing. For my part, I commend my soul to God, and my body to earth. Remember me kindly, for I have always loved you." When the news reached the king, the court said he wept. Others claimed he wore yellow that day, the color of joy. History remembers both stories, but truth often hides between them. Perhaps he wept because the last woman who had ever truly loved him was gone. Perhaps he smiled because guilt can look like freedom. Either way, the candle that had burned since her coronation finally died. In Spain, bells tolled for her, as they once had for saints. In England, no state funeral was held. Only a small procession followed her coffin to Peterborough, cathedral soldiers, priests, and a few loyal servants. The banners bore her crest, the pomegranate of Castile faded, but unbroken. Snow fell as they carried her through the gates. And there, beneath the vaulted ceiling, she was laid to rest not as Queen of England, but as a daughter of Spain. Years later, when her daughter Mary ascended the throne, the court hung new banners at Peterborough. They read only one phrase, the title, "She had never surrendered." Catherine the Queen. Her legacy did not end with death. It lived in the conscience of a nation, in the tears of a daughter, and in the torment of a king who would never again know peace. Catherine of Aragon, the faithful queen, left behind no son, but something far more enduring, the memory of a woman who stood unbroken before crown and church alike. In the years that followed, Henry's heart turned to another. Her name would echo through history, whispered in scandal, sung in rage. Where Catherine had knelt in faith, Anne Boleyn would rise in fire. And thus began the second chapter of his undoing. The first time Henry saw her, she was laughing. Not the soft, courtly laughter of an English lady, but a quicksilver sound, foreign, sharp, alive. It cut through the murmurs of the ballroom like a blade through silk. Anne Boleyn had returned from France, where women spoke in riddles and perfume, and even their sins were eloquent. She carried that world with her, the cadence of its elegance, the poison of its charm. When she curtsied before the king, her dark eyes did not lower long enough. And when she rose, Henry's pulse, that old drum of conquest, began again. Anne was not beautiful in the way queens were meant to be. Her features were too narrow, her mouth too bold, her eyes too knowing. But beauty had never been her weapon. She possessed something rarer, the art of making others forget she was not what they desired. She spoke as though words were candles, each one burning brighter than the last, drawing men close enough to forget the flame. Henry was accustomed to obedience, to reverence, disguised as affection. Anne gave him neither. When he praised her, she smiled. When he flirted, she withdrew. When he demanded, she vanished. She turned absence into allure. At first, it was a game one the courtiers watched with cruel delight. The king, once untouchable, now circled a lady like a moth to her laughter. Gifts arrived daily: jewels, silks, letters written in fevered script. Anne accepted some, returned others. When he sent her a brooch shaped like a Tudor rose, she pinned it to her gown and wore it before the court, but when he entered the hall, she turned away before he could see it. Her defiance was intoxicating. Henry, who had bent a kingdom to his will, now found himself begging for the smallest token of favor. Months turned into years. The court began to whisper the king's great matter was no longer a matter of law, but of lust. Catherine still prayed in exile, her rosary worn smooth with devotion, while Anne rose in influence like a dark star. Henry promised her everything: a crown, a kingdom, a son. But Anne had watched queens fall before. She had learned in France that power must be taken, not gifted. So she refused him. Not his love, his bed. Each time he reached for her, she stepped away, her voice a weapon cloaked in piety. "Your Majesty," she would murmur, "I would not dishonor myself without God's blessing or England's crown." And in that refusal, she sealed both her triumph and her fate. Henry's letters to her grew desperate, filled with ink-blotted phrases, half confessions, half commands. He wrote of his torment, his sleeplessness, his entirely yours heart body and soul. But beneath every word lay the same obsession: a son. Anne, clever as scripture, answered with measured tenderness, never too cold to lose him, never too warm to be caught. She played her part with the precision of a sermon. While England prayed for peace, Henry plotted war against heaven itself. By 1532, Rome had turned its back. The Pope refused annulment. The old queen still lived, steadfast and unbroken. And yet Henry's hunger had outgrown patience. That autumn, he and Anne rode through Dover, bound for Calais, a king and his mistress disguised as diplomacy. When they returned, the Church of England was no longer Rome's to command. Henry had crowned himself head of faith and nation. Anne had done what no monarch before her dared. She made desire divine. The wedding was secret, a winter ceremony, whispered rather than celebrated. But when spring came, she walked into Westminster Abbey not as a concubine, but as a queen. The bells rang hollow. The crowd watched in uneasy silence. No one cheered. Her coronation was a triumph of defiance. Yet even as she knelt before the altar, the air trembled with unease. For every candle lit that day, a shadow stretched behind it. Catherine's ghost lingered not in body, but in the quiet disapproval of every noblewoman who had once sworn loyalty to her. And beyond the abbey walls, London's streets murmured with contempt. To them, she was the witch, the usurper, the woman who broke the church. Anne, however, wore her crown like a challenge. Her gowns shimmered in crimson and gold. Her laughter filled the palace. She reigned with wit, with temper, with an authority that terrified courtiers accustomed to obedience. Henry called her "my lioness." She called herself the new Eve. When she conceived, London erupted in forced joy. The king ordered prayers in every church, processions in every parish. He swore that the child would be a prince, the one who would secure his legacy, the proof that his sins had been sanctified. Anne, radiant, believed it too. But when the cries came from her chamber in September 1533, and the midwives emerged pale and trembling, the truth was cruel. A daughter, Henry's disappointment curdled into silence. Anne named the child Elizabeth after his mother, a peace offering wrapped in prophecy. But the wound had already begun to rot. He visited less. His letters stopped. His eyes began to wander. Anne, once the fire that consumed him, now burned too brightly. Her temper flared. Her laughter became edged with fear. She saw ghosts not of Catherine, but of herself. At night, when she stood by the nursery and watched the infant breathe, she prayed to a God she no longer recognized. The walls of her palace echoed with her own footsteps, the corridors cold where once they had been alive with envy. She was Queen of England, yet she felt the noose of history tightening. In the spring of 1536, thunder rolled through the court once more. Henry had fallen from his horse, and for 2 days he lay unconscious. Anne miscarried soon after a boy. When she awoke, she asked if he lived. He did. But when he came to see her, his eyes held no trace of love, only accusation. He turned from her as he once had from Catherine, and the silence began again. The spring of 1536 carried a silence that seemed almost sacred, a quiet too heavy for joy, too sharp for peace. In the gardens of Greenwich, the wind turned cold even before the leaves did. Anne walked there alone, her steps tracing circles through the fading tulips, her thoughts caught between prayer and dread. The court, once bright with her laughter, had grown brittle. Smiles hid whispers. Eyes followed her not with admiration, but with hunger, the hunger of those who wait for a throne to tilt. Henry had changed. His face, once radiant with confidence, was swollen with age and resentment. He no longer spoke of destiny or divine right, only of betrayal. He hunted often, riding through the forests with a fury that frightened even his closest men. They said he no longer sought game, but penance. At court, a new presence had begun to glimmer, a quiet, pale figure with folded hands and downcast eyes. Jane Seymour. Where Anne had burned, Jane merely breathed. Where Anne commanded, Jane obeyed. And Henry, weary of fire, now longed for stillness. Rumors moved faster than truth. They whispered of Anne's lovers, of her French ways, of dances too intimate and glances too long. Each story was born from the same poison, the desire to see her fall. The men accused alongside her courtiers, poets, even her own brother were dragged into silence, one by one. Their confessions were extracted like rot from the body of the realm. Each word bled her a little more. She was no longer the king's beloved. She was the king's mistake. The day she was arrested, the sky over the Thames was the color of tarnished silver. Her ladies wept as she was led through the palace corridors she had once ruled with a glance. Her crown had been taken, but she carried herself as though she still wore it. Every step echoed like a prayer too late to be heard. At the Tower gates, she paused. History would remember that she knelt in the same place she had entered once as a queen. Now she entered as an echo. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone and betrayal. The tower was not built for mourning, it was built for endings. From her window, she could see the chapel where her bones would one day rest. Each night, she sat by the slit of light that passed for a window and watched the river move, slow and indifferent. It carried her past away the music, the jewels, the laughter that once shook the rafters of Whitehall. Henry did not visit. He had turned his face to God, or so he said. But his God had always looked remarkably like his reflection. The trial was theater, and she its condemned star. The court assembled in their finery, their jewels catching the pale light like knives. Her brother was brought before them, accused of unspeakable sin. Anne watched him stand, pale and proud, knowing that innocence had no place in this hall. When her verdict came guilty of adultery, treason, and witchcraft, the audience exhaled as if a play had ended. But for Anne, the curtain was just beginning to fall. In her final days, she asked for music. The guards thought her mad, but she smiled when the lute began to play. It was a melody from France, light, wistful, almost mocking. She had learned it as a girl, before England, before crowns, before she knew that love could kill. She arranged her few belongings with careful grace: a prayer book, a handkerchief, a small gold cross. Each item placed as though she were preparing not for death, but for mass. She wrote letters, none of which were answered. Perhaps Henry never read them. Perhaps he did, and pretended not to. At dawn on May 19th, the tower bells rang, not for coronation, for conclusion. Anne, dressed in a gown of deep gray, her hair hidden beneath a white coif. She moved through the halls with the same poise that had once captivated a king. Those who saw her swore she did not weep, but her eyes, dark, steady, and far too knowing, seemed to hold every secret the court had ever whispered. On the scaffold, the air trembled. A hush spread across the crowd. Even the ravens grew still. She knelt, the hem of her gown folding like waves at her feet. Her hands trembled only once when she reached for the cross. The French executioner waited, his sword gleaming like judgment itself. He had been summoned from Calais, swift, precise, merciful, they said. Anne lifted her gaze toward the gray sky, where clouds drifted like smoke from unseen fires. No one knew what she prayed for. Forgiveness, perhaps, or silence. When the blade fell, it was as quiet as snowfall. The crowd gasped, then murmured, then moved away. Within an hour, her body was gone. Within a day, her name was a curse. Within a month, another woman sat in her place. But the echoes remained. Every corridor that had once known her laughter now carried the faint hum of her defiance. Every church that Henry built in his own image carried the stain of her blood. Anne had given him a daughter, the one he never wanted, the one who would outshine them all. The world did not yet know it, but from her death would rise a queen whose reign would define an age. Elizabeth, the child of forbidden fire, born beneath a cursed crown, destined to rule without love, because love had destroyed her mother. At night, When the river whispered against the tower stones, it sounded almost like a voice, soft, lingering, and still alive. The king had asked for a son. God had given him a legend. The bells of London had barely ceased their echo from Anne Boleyn's fall, when a new silence rose to take their place. It was not mourning England had forgotten how to mourn, but a kind of uneasy stillness, the hush of a kingdom holding its breath. And in that hush, Jane Seymour became queen. She arrived like a shadow, pale and quiet, her eyes lowered even when the crown was placed upon her head. To the courtiers, she was everything Anne was not: modest, obedient, unthreatening. They called her a balm to the king's wounded soul. But she was not a balm. She was a ghost in waiting. Jane had lived in the same court that devoured Anne. She had watched the fire consume brilliance, and from the ashes she had learned the price of being seen. So she made herself invisible, the perfect virtue for a king who had grown afraid of his own desires. Henry looked upon her as one might look upon a prayer answered. Her gentleness soothed his rage. Her stillness reflected the peace he had long forsaken. He called her his true wife, though her crown still gleamed with the blood of another. The courtiers followed his lead. They bowed deeper, smiled wider, and spoke of divine justice, that the king had finally found favor with God again. But behind their smiles, the same fear lingered. A woman who could not give him a son could not keep her head. Jane understood this without needing to be told. Every night, she prayed longer than the candles could endure. She prayed not for love, nor mercy, only for a child. Her chambers smelled of lavender and wax, the quiet perfume of a woman who dared not breathe too loudly. Servants moved softly around her, as if the faintest noise might summon the ghosts that haunted the palace walls. Sometimes she dreamed of them, Catherine in her chapel veil, Anne with her head bowed and her lips still moving in prayer. She never spoke of it. The king hated ghosts. Summer bled into autumn, and with it came a growing stillness in Jane's body, a sign that her prayers had been answered. When the court learned she was with child, bells rang again over London, louder than for any victory. The people rejoiced. Priests declared that heaven had forgiven England. Henry walked through the palace with the swagger of salvation restored. Jane smiled when he entered her chamber. But it was a fragile smile, the kind that hides more than it reveals. Her health waned even as her belly grew. Every movement became a burden, every night a vigil. She endured it all in silence, because she had been taught that silence was the highest form of obedience. As the months passed, the king grew tender, or perhaps only grateful. He sat beside her bed, reading from the scriptures he once used to justify his sins. He called her his angel, his gift from God. But even angels have wings too fragile for earthly crowns. October came cold and wet. The Thames shivered beneath gray skies, and the palace seemed to hold its breath again. Jane labored for 2 days and nights, her cries swallowed by the rain. In another room, Henry prayed, or pretended to. He had prayed before and lost. Then, as dawn broke pale over Windsor, a sound pierced the silence, not a cry of pain, but the thin, bright wail of a newborn. A boy, a prince, an heir. The kingdom erupted in joy. Cannons thundered across the riverbanks. Bells clanged so fiercely that even the ravens took flight from the tower. Henry wept the only tears he had ever shed for another soul. At last, his line was secured. At last, his God had answered. Jane smiled when they placed the infant in her arms. Her face, pale as linen, glowed with something both holy and mortal. She whispered a prayer no one could hear, and then, exhausted, she slept. For 12 days, England celebrated. Feasts were held, songs composed, coins minted with the image of the king and his newborn son. The Queen's name was spoken in every church, every tavern, every whispered blessing. But in her chamber, the candles burned lower. Jane's body had begun to fail her. The birth had taken too much blood, strength, and breath alike. The physicians came and went, muttering prayers of medicine and faith. The king refused to believe. He sat by her bed, holding her hand, a hand so thin and cold it felt already carved from marble. He promised her life, promised her anything, but promises mean little to God. On the 13th day, Jane opened her eyes once more. The dawn filtered through the curtains like mist, pale and trembling. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Only her eyes spoke not of fear, but of release. And then she was gone. The bells tolled again. Not for triumph, for requiem. Henry shut himself away, draped the palace in black, and wore mourning longer for her than for any other wife. The court called it devotion, but it was guilt, the one thing that had always loved him faithfully. He had broken the church for one woman, destroyed another for desire, and now lost the only one who had ever obeyed him completely. Her death was his first honest punishment. They buried Jane Seymour in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beneath stone arches so high they seemed to pierce the clouds. The air was thick with incense and grief too disciplined to cry. As the coffin descended, Henry stood motionless. For the first time, he looked not like a king, but like a man who had realized too late that God keeps count. Years later, he would demand to be buried beside her, the only wife he would call beloved, the only one who gave him what he wanted, and the only one who could never take it away. She gave him peace through death. The black banners hung across every tower in Windsor. They fluttered in the winter wind like the tattered wings of angels who had forgotten how to fly. Jane Seymour was dead, and England stood between joy and ruin. For days, the palace smelled of wax and sorrow. Servants walked in silence, afraid that even the echo of their footsteps might disturb the king's grief. No music, no laughter, no sound but the slow tolling of bells that carried across the river like the heartbeat of morning itself. In the Queen's chambers, everything remained untouched. Her embroidery frame still held a half-finished cross of gold thread. Her prayer book lay open to the Psalm of Deliverance, but no one dared close it. The words felt too sacred or too dangerous. Henry shut himself away for weeks. He ate alone, prayed alone, and stared into the fire, as if searching for meaning in the flames. Those who caught glimpses of him said he had grown older overnight. The light in his eyes, once the light of conquest, now flickered like a candle, fighting to survive its own smoke. He had lost queens before, but this was different. Jane had not betrayed him, nor defied him, nor frightened him with her wit or her will. She had done nothing wrong, and still she died. In her death, Henry found the only truth he had ever feared, that even kings cannot command God. Outside, England rejoiced and mourned in equal measure. Church bells rang in thanksgiving for Prince Edward's birth, and funeral bells answered them for Jane's passing. It was a duet of faith and despair, the kingdom's salvation sung in a minor key. The people called her the Good Queen, the one who had restored grace to England. Her image was painted in white and gold, her expression serene, untouched by earthly sorrow. In every depiction, she held her infant son close, the living proof of her sanctity. But even sanctity fades. As the months passed, the court's whispers returned. New alliances, new treaties, new names of princesses who might become the next queen. The wheel of marriage turned again, slow and merciless. Jane's portrait was hung in the gallery beside the others, another face in a growing gallery of ghosts. Yet Henry did not forget her. He carried her memory like a relic, heavy and holy. When ambassadors spoke of new brides, his eyes darkened. He would not forgive them for speaking of marriage so soon. He spoke of Jane as if she were still listening. Perhaps, in some way, she was. He built her tomb before he built his own, every stone carved in her honor, every verse etched to praise her virtue. He called her the one true wife. But the courtiers understood this devotion was not love reborn, but love embalmed. It was grief preserved in marble, because he could not bear to hold it in flesh. As years passed, Jane's presence haunted the palace, not with footsteps or whispers, but with comparison. Every woman who came after her lived in her shadow. The courtiers measured them against her calmness, her obedience, her quiet death. Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, all judged by a ghost who had never raised her voice. In his loneliness, Henry idealized what he had lost. He spoke of Jane's virtue as if it absolved his sins. He called her the proof of God's forgiveness, though she had died as the price of his favor. And so the myth of the pale saint was born. They painted her in pure white robes, crowned not with gold but with lilies. They wrote hymns to her gentleness, though few remembered the fear that had shadowed her days. History made her holy, because holiness demands silence. Edward grew frail and pale like the mother he never knew. The kingdom watched him as it once watched his father, desperate for him to survive, desperate for him to mean something. And when he smiled, they said he had her eyes. Henry wept when he heard that. He never spoke of Anne again, never uttered Catherine's name. But Jane's name passed his lips in prayer, in memory, in guilt. She had become his confessor, the one to whom he explained himself when no one else dared listen. In the later years, when Henry's body began to fail him, when his leg rotted and his soul grew heavy with fear, he ordered a chair carried into St. George's Chapel. There, before Jane's tomb, he sat for hours, unmoving. The courtiers waited outside, hearing nothing but the faint hum of the wind through the stained glass. Some said he spoke to her. Others said he heard her speak back. Perhaps neither was true. Perhaps it was only the sound of a man trying to find forgiveness in the silence he created. When he finally rose, he touched the cold stone of her grave, and for a brief moment, he looked peaceful, as if the dead had finally answered him. He left orders that when he died, his coffin was to be laid beside hers. No other wife would share his rest. Only Jane, the one who had given him a son and taken his soul in return. Years later, when the king's body was lowered into the crypt beside hers, the candles flickered in the chapel, and the wind whispered through the arches. The priests prayed in Latin, the courtiers bowed, and somewhere beyond the marble silence, two names rested side by side, Henry and Jane. In the end, it was the quietest love story ever told. A woman who saved his crown by dying, and a man who sought eternity beside the only one he could not destroy. He had built an empire for his son and a tomb for his heart. Winter crept through Whitehall like a rumor. The corridors smelled of damp stone and candle wax, and the air was heavy with the ghost of a queen whose name was still whispered in prayer. Jane Seymour had been dead for 2 years, and England was restless again. A kingdom without a queen is a kingdom that waits for danger. The council pressed for alliance. Across the Channel, Europe shifted like a chessboard, the Emperor and the King of France circling each other, each waiting for the other to stumble. Henry needed a new wife, not for love, but for survival. He wanted peace. He wanted admiration. He wanted someone who would not die in childbirth or in rebellion. He sent for portraits, dozens of faces, princesses, widows, noble women, painted in idealized perfection, their eyes bright, their smiles thin as promises. But one portrait stopped him cold. A young woman from Cleves, serene, solemn, draped in sober German silk. Her face, painted by Holbein, was not seductive, but pure. There was calmness in her gaze, a quiet dignity that seemed incorruptible. Henry stared at the portrait for hours. He convinced himself that God had guided his choice. He spoke of her as if he already knew her soul. He called her a comfort sent by heaven. Anne of Cleves crossed the sea in midwinter. The winds tore at the sails, and the deck was slick with frost, but she never complained. She prayed each morning and each night, her German psalms mingling with the crash of the waves. She did not yet know the man waiting for her believed in images more than in truth. When she arrived in England, the people gathered to see the woman who would be queen. She smiled shyly, unaware of the theater she had entered. Henry, impatient as ever, disguised himself to surprise her, a gesture he imagined would reveal their destined connection. He entered her chamber unannounced, dressed as a commoner, expecting her to swoon with recognition. But Anne, startled by the intrusion of a strange man, bowed politely and looked away. The silence that followed was the sound of an illusion collapsing. Henry's face hardened. His pride, that fragile monument built on flattery and fantasy, cracked beneath the weight of her confusion. He turned to his courtiers and muttered words that would become legend. "She looks like a horse." The wedding went forward regardless. The alliance demanded it. But from that day, the king's disappointment became the kingdom's secret. He refused to consummate the marriage. He claimed she repelled him, though she had done nothing wrong. At night, he slept in another room. In the morning, he complained to his physicians that the matter cannot be done. Anne did not understand the ridicule that bloomed around her. Her English was poor, her manners too modest, her laughter too sincere. She tried to please him, learning his games, his feasts, his dances, but Henry's gaze never softened. He had fallen in love with a painting and married the woman who ruined it. Yet Anne possessed a wisdom that none of his other wives had. She watched, she listened, and when the storm began to turn against her, she did not fight it. Rumors reached her. The king sought annulment. His counselors whispered of new matches. Anne did not cry. She requested a private audience with Henry. When she entered the chamber, she bowed low, not as a wife, but as a servant of peace. He looked at her cautious, expectant, ready for anger. But she only said, through her interpreter, that she wished for his happiness, that she would accept whatever God and the king decided. For the first time in years, Henry was silent, not out of guilt, but bewilderment. No one had ever surrendered to him so gently. No tears, no threats, no accusations, only calm resignation. Within weeks, the marriage was annulled. The court expected her to vanish into obscurity, exiled like the others. But Henry, moved by her composure, granted her the title the king's sister. He gave her estates, income, and freedom. Anne bowed again, not in defeat, but in triumph. When the courtiers mocked her, she smiled. When they called her plain, she walked through her gardens in peace. While the next queen danced toward her own destruction, Anne watched from a distance, alive and unburdened. In her letters, she wrote that she had found a quiet life and no fear of falling. The other women had been queens for a season. She became a legend for surviving the game without bleeding. She was the only one who laughed at the monster and walked away. Spring returned to England with reluctant sunlight. The frost melted from the palace gardens, revealing new blooms over old graves. Whitehall glittered with feasts and masks again, as if the air could forget the silence of annulment. But behind every smile lay relief. The court had survived another queen. Anne lived quietly in her manor at Richmond. She kept a small household, rode her horses in the mornings, played cards in the evenings. She had become something rare in Henry's England, a woman who owed him nothing and feared him not. The servants adored her for her patience, her easy laughter, and her refusal to gossip about the king. Sometimes she would receive visitors from court women who came trembling, hoping to learn how she had done it. Her answer was always the same: by not wanting to be loved by a man who cannot love himself. But though she lived at peace, the world she left behind did not. Henry, restless and aging, had begun to sink into self-pity. His body ached, his legs swollen and ulcered, his temper a tide of thunder. He no longer sought God, he sought distraction. And that distraction soon took the shape of a girl half his age. Catherine Howard entered court like a spark near dry parchment. Young, radiant, careless, a niece of the Duke of Norfolk and cousin to Anne Boleyn. She danced when she should have curtsied, laughed when silence was safer. Her beauty intoxicated the courtiers first, then the king. She was everything. Anne of Cleves was not delicate, impulsive, filled with music instead of prudence. Henry adored her instantly. He called her his rose without a thorn. The court echoed with the sound of her name, sweet and poisonous. He showered her with jewels, gowns, and praise, as if the youth he had lost could be purchased and worn again. From Richmond, Anne heard the news. The court gossiped, as it always did, and she smiled. She sent Catherine a letter of congratulations, gracious, distant, sincere. It was the gesture of a woman who had seen enough to know how quickly crowns become shackles. Catherine's reign began in laughter and ended in whispers. The same courtiers who praised her beauty began to question her past. Jealous tongues recalled old lovers, youthful indiscretions, secrets whispered in the dark. The king, blind in infatuation, refused to listen. But beneath the perfume of the court, something sour was growing. Anne watched from afar. In her garden, she listened to the bells of London tolling for Lent, and wondered how long the new queen's spring would last. She pitied her not for the sin, but for the ignorance of what it meant to love Henry Tudor. For to be loved by him was to stand on a pyre made of silk and prayer. When the news finally came, it arrived like thunder over quiet fields. Catherine Howard had been accused of adultery. The girl who once made the king feel young again now made him feel mocked, humiliated, old beyond redemption. The palace doors closed. The laughter vanished. Within weeks, the same hands that had crowned her fastened the iron clasp of the tower around her wrists. Henry did not weep. He raged at her, at God, at time itself. He had once burned a church for love. Now he would burn a girl for betrayal. The courtiers whispered prayers they did not mean. Anne, hearing of the trial, said only, "The rose has met its thorn." On the day Catherine was executed, the sky hung low and gray over the tower. The crowd gathered, silent and cold. Some wept, some crossed themselves. Most simply watched as they had watched before, as they would watch again. The sword fell clean, and England exhaled another ghost. At Richmond, Anne walked to the chapel and lit a candle. Not for Catherine, not even for the king, but for every woman who had stood in that place, believing she could survive the fire by loving the man who lit it. In the years that followed, Henry grew heavier, slower, swallowed by his own creation. He visited Anne occasionally, always polite, always distant. He would sit beside her in the garden, speak of politics and God, and she would listen with gentle indifference. Sometimes he would laugh, almost fondly, as if remembering the man he once pretended to be. "You were wise to let me go," he told her once. Anne bowed her head and said, "Your Majesty, I never had to." He smiled at that, the weary smile of a man who finally understood that mercy is not weakness. Then he rose, limped to his carriage, and vanished into the dusk. It was the last time she saw him alive. Years later, when Henry was buried beneath the stones of St. George's Chapel, Anne of Cleves sent no flowers. She simply opened her window to the wind, the air carrying the faint tolling of bells from Windsor. She thought of all the queens who had died young, whose beauty had been their ruin, whose love had been their executioner, and she whispered a prayer in German, a prayer not of mourning, but of gratitude. She lived quietly until her death in 1557, the only one of Henry's wives buried in Westminster Abbey. No great monument marked her grave, only the words, "Queen of England." But those who knew her called her something else. The woman who survived Henry's heart. She was the only one who laughed at the monster and walked away. The corridors of Whitehall no longer echoed with prayer. They pulsed instead with laughter high, reckless, and bright as wine. Catherine Howard had arrived, and with her came the scent of roses and ruin. She was young enough to be the king's granddaughter, yet she carried herself like a melody too loud for silence. Her gown shimmered with scarlet embroidery, her hair like liquid gold beneath candlelight. To the courtiers, she was spring reborn. To Henry, she was the last chance to feel immortal. He watched her at feasts with the gaze of a drowning man. Every smile was salvation, every gesture a promise that he was not yet finished. His courtiers bowed and praised, but behind their reverence lingered a shadow, the whisper that the king's passion had become madness. Catherine danced through it all, unaware of the cracks beneath her feet. She did not see the ghosts that followed her down the corridors, Anne Boleyn's shadow on the stone, Jane Seymour's breath in the silence. She believed herself chosen by love, not by history's cruel repetition. The wedding took place in the heat of summer, 1540. The bells of London rang once more, though less joyfully than before. The people gathered, hopeful and weary, for another queen, another promise, another prayer for a son. But the king's face betrayed him. Beneath his jewels, the flesh sagged, the eyes dull with pain. His leg, wrapped in linen and decay, bled beneath his robes. He stood beside Catherine, radiant and unblemished, and for a moment he believed that youth could be borrowed. That night, the court feasted. Musicians played, torches flickered against the gilded ceilings, and Catherine sat beside the king like a painted saint. She smiled, and he mistook it for devotion. When he lifted his goblet, trembling, she lifted hers too, and in that mirrored motion, England sealed another fate. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into whispers. Catherine's laughter filled the gardens, her beauty filled the court. She was adored by servants, envied by ladies, worshipped by men who did not dare to meet her eyes. Even the king's temper softened for a time. He called her his jewel of joy, his angel without sin. But joy in the Tudor court was fragile as glass. Behind every bouquet bloomed rot. The Duke of Norfolk, her ambitious uncle, reminded her of duty. She must smile, must please, must bear a son, the child that would redeem her bloodline and secure her family's fortune. Catherine nodded, though her heart fluttered elsewhere. For before she was queen, she had been a girl foolish, free, and in love. Frances Dereham had once whispered to her in the dark halls of Lambeth, when she was nothing but a lady in waiting. Those whispers had not vanished. They had only changed their tone. And now, within the court's golden cage, memory became betrayal. Autumn came early that year. The nights grew longer, the candles burned lower. Henry's health worsened. His mood darkened. Catherine smiled harder, danced longer, but the laughter no longer reached her eyes. The king's legs stank of rot, his pain turning prayer into rage. And the courtiers scenting blood began to circle. One evening, while Catherine embroidered by the window, she saw him watching her Thomas Culpeper, a young gentleman of the chamber. His eyes lingered too long, his bow too low. She looked away, but something unspoken passed between them. Not love, not lust, but recognition. Two souls bound by the same dangerous hunger for escape. They began to meet in secret. A locked chamber, a whisper behind the arras. The risk itself was intoxicating, to be alive in a palace built on fear. But every secret in Henry's court had ears. The walls themselves were confessionals, the air thick with spies. And soon, the name Catherine Howard became a prayer, whispered not in reverence, but anticipation. Far away, Anne of Cleves heard the rumors. The messenger bowed low, voice trembling with gossip and pity. Anne closed her eyes and sighed. "She dances in silk," she murmured, "and soon she will die in silence." The same fate repeated the same script, written by God or guilt or both. History once again demanded its offering. November 1541. The king received a sealed letter. The Archbishop of Canterbury, pale and shaking, handed it to him in private. Inside, accusations, names, dates, the sins of his rose without a thorn. Henry's face drained of color. He read each word as if carving them into his own flesh. Adultery, treason, lies. The same words that had once ended Anne Boleyn. The goblet fell from his hand, wine spilling like blood across the marble floor. He shouted for silence, though no one had spoken. And for the first time, the mighty Henry VIII wept not for love, but for humiliation. Catherine was seized that night. The corridors that once shimmered with her perfume now echoed with her sobs. Her jewels were stripped, her letters burned, her friends imprisoned. Frances Dereham was tortured. Thomas Culpeper confessed. And still, Catherine pleaded not for mercy, but for time to breathe. In her chamber in the Tower, she prayed before the dawn. The same walls that had heard her cousin's last breath now awaited hers. She was 18, the youngest queen, the shortest reign, the softest heart. She asked for the block to be brought before her so she could practice. The guards obeyed. She placed her neck upon the wood, whispered a prayer to no one in particular, and smiled. She danced in silk and died in silence. The morning broke gray over the tower. Fog drifted low across the Thames, swallowing the sound of bells. The ravens gathered early that day, black silhouettes against a sky that refused to brighten. Within her cell, Catherine knelt on the cold stone floor, her gown of white trembling against the chill. The light from the narrow window cut across her face, soft, uncertain, almost merciful. She was no longer the king's jewel, nor the court's delight. She was only a girl waiting to be forgotten. The guards spoke little. They moved with the hollow rhythm of men who had seen this too many times before. When they brought her a small wooden cross, she pressed it to her lips, though her prayers had long since lost meaning. No confession could undo the machinery she had awakened. Her beauty had built her pyre, and her innocence would only make the flames burn cleaner. Outside, the city prepared. The scaffold stood waiting, freshly sanded, the axe gleaming under a damp shroud. Londoners gathered, wrapped in shawls, whispering names as though each syllable might summon the ghost of Anne Boleyn. History, they knew, was about to repeat itself. The king did not attend. He remained at Whitehall, secluded in his chambers, the sound of the river masking his own restless pacing. The courtiers said he prayed for her soul, but those close enough to hear swore he cursed her name between sobs. In the great hall, his physicians hovered, silent as tombstones. The ulcer in his leg festered, the bandages soaked through. The stench filled the room, mingling with the scent of incense burning futilely in gold basins. Henry stared into the fire, and in every flicker of flame he saw her laughing, spinning, alive. Catherine had reminded him of the world before pain, of when he could ride, dance, love. Now, stripped of her, he felt time reclaim him like a debt unpaid. The guilt came not as sorrow, but as echo. He could not tell whether he mourned Catherine or the man he had been when she smiled at him. At the tower, the steps creaked as Catherine ascended. The crowd fell silent. The wind carried the faint toll of a distant church bell, one final, trembling note. She reached the platform with the grace of a dancer, her youth still clinging to her like perfume. The executioner bowed his head, his hands shaking slightly. She thanked him softly, though her voice was lost in the wind. The spectators held their breath. The girl knelt. Her hair, golden and loose, fell forward over her shoulders. For a moment, she seemed like a saint sculpted from light. Then the axe fell. One clean motion. No scream, only the heavy sound of history repeating itself. The crowd exhaled as one relief, fear, awe. Some crossed themselves, others turned away. Above them, the sky opened briefly, a single beam of pale sunlight falling upon the block. It looked almost like forgiveness. In Whitehall, word arrived before noon. The messenger knelt, eyes to the ground. Henry said nothing. He turned from the fire, his face a mask of iron. But when the door closed, he let out a sound, not rage, not grief, but exhaustion. He had become the very thing he feared. A king alone, surrounded by ghosts. That night, he walked the corridors where Catherine used to dance. The tapestry swayed as if stirred by her laughter. The torches flickered and hissed, their smoke twisting into shapes the mind should not see. He thought he heard her a whisper, soft as breath. A voice that said nothing, only remembered. He pressed his hand against the cold stone wall, feeling the pulse of the palace, the same walls that had watched him destroy every woman who dared to love him. Weeks passed. The court resumed its rhythm banquets, sermons, decrees. Yet the music no longer reached the king's chambers. The once mighty ruler of England now sat alone in rooms too large, too quiet. The portraits of his queens stared down at him, their painted eyes calm, unblinking. He began to dream again. In one dream, Catherine danced barefoot through a field of roses, each bloom dripping red. She looked back at him, her smile neither cruel nor kind. When he reached for her, she vanished, leaving only petals that turned to ash in his hands. In another, Anne Boleyn stood beside her, silent. Then Jane Seymour joined them. Then Catherine of Aragon. All six appeared, forming a circle around him, their faces serene, their hands folded, their eyes bright with unspoken judgment. He tried to speak, but no sound came. When he woke, his pillow was wet with sweat and tears. The people of England moved on, as they always did. New laws were passed. New wars whispered. But among the women of the court, a quiet understanding grew that beauty could be fatal, and the smile of a king was only the beginning of mourning. They wore darker gowns, softer voices, eyes lowered not from humility but survival. No one spoke Catherine's name aloud. Yet every time the bells of the tower rang, they flinched as if expecting her laughter to return on the wind. The tower kept its silence. In the crypt below, her body lay beside others who had learned too late that love and power are one and the same sin. No marker named here. Only the ravens remembered. And in the royal chapel, Henry knelt once more before the crucifix. He looked up at the figure of Christ, the broken body, the crown of thorns. He wondered if forgiveness was possible for kings. He wondered if heaven allowed ghosts to follow. For the first time in years, he prayed without asking for anything. Only that the faces would fade. Only that the silence would come. But it did not. She danced in silk and died in silence. And in that silence, the king finally heard himself. The year was fading, and with it the king. Henry sat beneath a canopy of state, wrapped in velvet, swollen and pale, his leg bound tight with linen and prayer. The crown still gleamed on his head, but the light of rule had turned inward into the slow decay of a man once touched by glory. Outside, winter gnawed at the palace walls. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of herbs, wax, and resignation. The courtiers bowed, whispered, vanished. Few could stand long in his presence now. The smell of rot clung to him, and so did memory. He had outlived 5 wives, but not one ghost. Then came Catherine Parr. She did not arrive with the fanfare of beauty or the promise of sons. Her entrance was quiet, deliberate, like a candle brought into a tomb. A widow twice over, her life had already known both tenderness and loss. She came to court with books instead of jewels, and prayers sharper than politics. The king saw in her something unexpected, calm, composed, untouched by the fever of youth. She spoke with reason, not seduction. And yet, in that restraint, he found a strange comfort. She did not seek to please him, only to understand him. At first, he called her the healer of my heart. But Catherine knew better than to believe in royal poetry. She understood the weight of crowns, how they could crush even the soul that wore them. She had studied the scriptures, read the writings of reformers, forbidden in England, and carried in her heart the quiet rebellion of thought. While Henry had torn a church apart for love, Catherine sought to mend a faith broken by fear. Whitehall, under her care, began to change. She restored light to the chapel, introduced new psalms, and filled the corridors with scholars instead of courtiers. Servants spoke of her gentleness. Bishops muttered of her intellect. She was the king's 6th wife, but unlike the others, she did not belong to him. At night, when the palace slept, Catherine wrote. By candlelight, she penned meditations on faith, forgiveness, and the soul's duty to seek truth above obedience. Her words were dangerous. Though written with devotion, for in Henry's court, theology was treason disguised as prayer. Still, she persisted, because somewhere between fear and faith, she found herself. Henry watched her closely. He had come to fear the power of women who could think. Catherine's calm unsettled him. She spoke to him as an equal, sometimes even as a teacher. And when he raged against Rome, or against the memory of his dead queens, she did not flinch. There were nights when she would read aloud from the Gospels, her voice steady, patient. Henry would sit in silence, his fingers twitching upon his cane, his mind torn between devotion and doubt. He had made himself the head of the church. Yet here was his wife reminding him that no man could crown himself divine. Her faith was not defiance, yet to him it felt like judgment. He began to sense in her presence the weight of something greater than his power, a quiet holiness he could neither command nor destroy. The court whispered, as it always did. They called her the Book Queen, half in admiration, half in mockery. Some said she bewitched the king with her piety, others that she planned to reform the church through his bed. The bishops, jealous of her influence, watched her every move. They gathered evidence, her writings, her companions, the reformist books she kept hidden beneath her pillow. One by one, her enemies aligned. The same machinery that had devoured Anne Boleyn began to stir again. This time, the charge would not be adultery, it would be heresy. Summer came. Henry's leg grew worse, his temper sharper. He shouted at his council, dismissed his physicians, broke his crucifix in rage. And in the shadows, the Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, prepared his snare. Late one night, a warrant was drawn. Catherine Parr, Queen of England, was to be arrested for treasonous writings against the church. The parchment was sealed. The order was signed. The trap was set. But fate, or perhaps faith, had other plans. The next morning, Catherine came to the king's chambers unaware of the warrant already carried by his guards. She found him seated by the fire, his face drawn and gray, his breath labored. On the table beside him lay the warrant, half hidden beneath a goblet of wine. She saw it before he could speak. She said nothing. Instead, she knelt, her expression serene, her words humble yet firm. She spoke of obedience, of duty, of love, not the love of a wife for a man, but the love of a soul seeking to guide another toward grace. Henry listened, and something within him, that small, dying spark of conscience, trembled. He dismissed the guards. He burned the warrant, and when he turned back to her, his voice was quieter than it had been in years. He said nothing of mercy. He only said, "You understand me too well." From that day, she was untouchable. The bishops fell silent. Her enemies vanished. Even death seemed to lose its appetite for her. For the first time in his life, Henry had found a woman who could both outthink and outpray him, and he feared her in ways he could never admit. Catherine remained at his side through his last decline, nursing him, advising him, praying for him even when he no longer prayed for himself. Her touch was steady, her eyes kind, her soul unwavering. Where others had perished by the crown, she endured by grace. And yet she knew survival in a kingdom built on blood was its own form of sacrifice. She prayed louder than his God, and in her prayer, the crown finally bowed. Winter thickened around Whitehall, as if the world itself were dying alongside its king. Frost traced the windows, sealing the royal chambers in a pale, sacred stillness. Within, the air reeked of medicine and mortal decay. The king's leg, swollen and rotting, had to be drained each morning, a ritual both physical and divine, as though England itself bled through him. Catherine Parr stood at his bedside, her gown dark, her prayers quiet. No tears came. She had long ago learned that grief was not a gesture, but a discipline. Every breath she took beside him was an act of endurance. Every word of scripture she whispered was a shield not against death, but against despair. Henry no longer recognized the mirror. His face had become a mask of indulgence and penance, alike the consequence of a lifetime spent demanding both sin and sanctity. Yet, in his final months, he clung to Catherine's presence, as if her faith might somehow redeem him. At times, she wondered if that was her true calling, not as a queen, not even as a wife, but as his last confessor. The court had grown hollow. The laughter of courtiers was gone, replaced by the slow march of priests and the murmurs of power shifting behind doors. Everyone could smell the change. England waited not for salvation, but for inheritance. Edward, the boy born of Jane Seymour's death, was 9 years old, a fragile hope in the hands of ambitious men. Catherine looked at him sometimes and felt both pity and dread. He was a child crowned by tragedy, and like all sons of kings, his innocence was already a political weapon. She often prayed for him, though she dared not speak her fears aloud. For in a kingdom ruled by ghosts, truth was the most dangerous prayer of all. The king's health collapsed in January of 1547. Each morning, his attendants found him lost between delirium and repentance. He called out names: Catherine, Anne, Mary, Jane, his voice thick with guilt and fever. The 6 faces of his sin hovered above him like saints turned executioners. Catherine remained near, though she had long ceased to expect kindness. Her devotion was no longer for him, but for the idea of mercy, that even a man who had torn down heaven for his desires might find peace in the silence before death. When the end finally came, it was not dramatic. No thunder cracked the sky. No angel descended. Just the low rattle of a dying breath, and then stillness. Henry VIII, once the most powerful man in Christendom, died in his sleep, his crown resting upon the table beside him, heavy with sins too great to measure. Catherine Parr did not cry. She simply bowed her head, whispered a psalm, and let the candle burn down to ash. For the first time in her life, she was free. No husband, no crown, no threat of execution hidden behind a royal smile. Yet even freedom was heavy, for in its shadow lay the memories of 6 women whose names had become legends of warning. Catherine knew her survival was not triumph. It was testament. She left court soon after the funeral. The bells of London tolled for days, echoing over a nation uncertain of its soul. The boy King Edward VI was crowned, pale and solemn, and the reformation that Henry had begun in lust was now reborn in zeal. Catherine withdrew to Chelsea Manor, near the river, where the air was gentler and the whispers of politics faded into the wind. There, she wrote again, not as queen, but as scholar. Her final work, The Lamentation of a Sinner, was her confession and her victory both. In it she spoke of grace, of human frailty, of the soul's longing to meet God without the intercession of men. It was the first book in England ever published by a woman under her own name. And though she wrote of repentance, her words carried a quiet defiance. The same faith that had once burned under Henry's shadow now stood in the open, unafraid. The years that followed were peaceful, though peace in England never lasted long. Catherine remarried to Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Jane. He was charming, ambitious, and reckless, a man too enamored with his own reflection to see the danger of loving a queen. For a brief moment, Catherine believed in ordinary happiness. She bore a child, a daughter, whom she named Mary. But fate, ever loyal to tragedy, had not finished its work. Only days after childbirth, Catherine fell ill with fever. The room grew dim, her skin burned, and the world slipped into mist. Her husband wept, or pretended to. But Catherine, even as she lay dying, did not curse her fate. She whispered, "My soul is God's now." And then silence. She was buried quietly, without the splendor due to queens, in a small chapel in Gloucestershire. No marble monument, no royal choir, just a stone, a cross, and the river nearby, whispering her name into eternity. Yet her legacy would not vanish. In the years that followed, her writings would shape the conscience of England's new religion more than any decree or sermon. Her hand, steady in ink, had done what no sword could. It had taught a kingdom to think. Far beyond the grave, her influence lingered. When Mary Tudor rose to the throne, she carried her mother's vengeance but Catherine Parr's scriptures. When Elizabeth I ruled, she bore the intellect and discipline that Parr had once personified. In both, the echo of that 6th queen endured the woman who had faced tyranny not with rebellion, but with understanding. She had lived among monsters and emerged untainted. Her power was not in command, but in conviction. Her crown was not of gold, but of grace. She prayed louder than his God, And when the kingdom fell silent, her words were the only ones still breathing. Thus ended the story of Catherine Parr, the last wife, the last witness, the last light. She did not die on the scaffold, nor vanish in scandal. She survived. And in a world built by men and undone by faith, survival was the holiest victory of all. Winter had turned England to stone. The sky hung low, heavy with ash, and the Thames flowed sluggishly beneath a crust of frost. In the shadow of Whitehall Palace, the banners no longer stirred. The Lion of England, proud, golden, and furious, seemed asleep. But inside the palace walls, something older than sleep had settled. Something like rot. Henry VIII was no longer the radiant prince of 1509. The boy who had once jousted under banners of gold and blue had become a monument to excess, swollen, sullen, and consumed by the weight of his own creation. The King of England, defender of the faith, lay captive to his own body. His leg, the same that had once carried him through tournaments and hunts, had turned against him, ulcered and fetid. Each morning, physicians peeled away the bandages, and the stench filled the chamber like incense for a dying god. The courtiers spoke softly now. They bowed lower, moved slower, as though afraid that even their footsteps might awaken the old fury that still smoldered behind the king's rheumy eyes. For though his body had failed him, his will had not. He ruled still through dread, through memory, through the echo of what he had once been. He spent long hours alone, surrounded by relics of his triumphs, portraits of his 6 wives, the tapestries of battles long won, the gilded armor that no longer fit him. The walls whispered of glory, yet the silence between those whispers was unbearable. He often looked to the portrait of Anne Boleyn. The artist had softened her gaze, but Henry knew that expression, the half-smile that promised heaven and delivered damnation. He had ordered her painted so, years after her death, as if art might forgive what truth had condemned. Anne, he had once murmured, when his mind drifted between prayer and delirium. She gave me a daughter in a church. Now, even in his solitude, he avoided looking too long. He feared her eyes would open. The ghosts had begun to visit him not in sleep, but in waking. Sometimes he would catch the scent of orange blossoms in the air and remember Catherine of Aragon's chapel prayers. Other times he'd hear the faint rustle of silk, the echo of Anne's laughter from a distant hall. Jane Seymour's shadow lingered near the cradle of the boy who was now king, a quiet specter of peace and sacrifice. The court whispered that the king spoke to the dead, but in truth, it was not madness. It was memory, and memory, for Henry, had always been a punishment more cruel than any hellfire. When he stood before his mirror, he scarcely recognized himself. The once handsome monarch had dissolved into folds of flesh and regret. His hair, once golden, was now sparse and silver. His eyes, once sharp, had grown clouded not with blindness, but with the knowledge of too much truth. He thought often of his youth, of Catherine of Aragon's patience, of Anne's fire, of Jane's mercy. He wondered if any of it had been love or merely hunger, disguised as divinity. Had he ever sought God, or only justification? Had he torn down the Church of Rome to free England, or to free himself from his own vows? The Reformation, that great storm he had unleashed, now swept beyond his control. The faith he had once commanded had splintered into factions, each claiming to speak for God, none truly listening. And in that cacophony, Henry saw himself reflected, proud, furious, and lost. In the nights, he would dream of Westminster Abbey, the place of his coronation. He saw himself kneeling again, young and radiant, beneath the vaulted arches, the crown heavy in his trembling hands. He had promised God glory, peace, and legacy. Instead, he had given him a nation divided, a church fractured, and 6 graves. He would awaken drenched in sweat, his breath ragged, the echoes of his vow ringing in his skull. To rule by God's grace. What grace had he ruled by? The grace of fear? The grace of desire? Or or the grace of ambition so blinding that it mistook itself for faith. Each time he rose from that bed, he felt smaller not as a king, but as a man undone by the very crown that had once made him divine. He began to speak less. When the council brought petitions or edicts, he signed them in silence. His signature, once bold and confident, had become a trembling scrawl, a shadow of command. His counselors whispered that the king's mind was failing, but they were wrong. It was not his mind that faltered. It was his certainty. For the first time in his reign, Henry doubted that God was listening. At night, the wind howled across the palace gardens, the same gardens where Anne Boleyn had once walked, where Catherine Howard had once laughed before her execution. Now, the hedges were unkempt, the statues streaked with rain, the fountains dry. All beauty in the kingdom seemed to have withdrawn into mourning. Sometimes he imagined the 6 women standing among those withered roses, each holding a candle, their faces serene, not accusing, not forgiving, merely waiting. They did not haunt him to torment him. They came to witness his confession, and perhaps deep down Henry longed to give it. He ordered his chaplain to bring him the Bible, not the Latin scripture of Rome, but the English version he had once sanctioned, the language of his people, the fruit of his rebellion. He ran his hand across the pages, but the words blurred before him. He could not read them anymore, not because his eyes were weak, but because he no longer knew what they meant. He had made himself God's instrument, yet every act of faith had been shadowed by pride. Every marriage, every divorce, every execution justified in the name of heaven. But now, standing at the edge of eternity, he could no longer tell the difference between God's will and his own. The truth struck him with cruel simplicity. He had not built a church. He had built an altar to himself. The bells of Whitehall tolled for vespers. Outside, the city slept under a veil of frost. The king sat alone, the candlelight trembling across his worn features. He was not yet dead, but death had already claimed his kingdom. Somewhere, in the corridors of his memory, the voices of his wives whispered again a chorus of love, pain, and absolution. Catherine prayed. Anne defied. Jane forgave. Anne of Cleves endured. Catherine Howard wept. Catherine Parr sang psalms in the dark. Together, they formed a hymn, one that no priest could write, no church could claim, and Henry listened. For once in his life, he did not command. He only listened. He built an empire on broken vows, and in the end, only the silence of those vows remained. The night came heavy and airless, pressing against the chambers of Whitehall like the hand of a patient executioner. Beyond the thick curtains, London slept, the restless city that had bowed, bled, and knelt for his crown. The king lay awake, his pulse shallow beneath the weight of his own body, the fire at his bedside sputtering in its last embers. The palace physicians had long since withdrawn. No prayers remained that had not already been spoken. Only the slow, steady sound of his own breath filled the room, a mortal rhythm that even a crown could not command. On the wall, the portraits of 6 women glowed faintly in the firelight. Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine, Catherine. 6 faces, 6 fates, bound by the same man who had sworn before God that each would be his salvation. Now they were his judgment. He turned his head, the silk pillow rustling beneath him like a shroud. The candle on the table beside him guttered once, twice, then steadied its flame, flickering low and blue. And in that wavering light, he saw her, Catherine of Aragon, the faithful queen, standing beside the bed. Her presence was neither warmth nor cold, but something vast and unyielding, like faith itself. Her gown was Spanish crimson, her hands clasped in prayer. She looked upon him not as a wife, but as a reckoning. He tried to speak, to beg forgiveness, to remember the Latin words he had once recited with her, but his throat failed him. Catherine's gaze did not accuse. It mourned. She had prayed for his soul, even as he cast her aside for a promise of sons. Her lips moved silently. Perhaps she prayed still. Perhaps she asked that even a man like him might find peace. Then, as the candle flickered, she was gone. In her place stood Anne Boleyn. Her black eyes gleamed like iron beneath a crown of shadow. The air thickened, charged with something almost alive, the scent of lilacs and blood. She wore no jewels, only the thin white collar that had once framed her neck before the blade fell. Anne looked at him, her head tilted slightly, the same gesture she had once made at court when teasing him, when her wit had been the flame that lit his ruin. Her smile was small and merciless. He remembered her laughter, her defiance, the way her voice had trembled not with fear, but with fury as the guards led her to the scaffold. He remembered, too, the day he signed her death warrant with a steady hand and an unsteady heart. Now her eyes held no anger, only pity, and that pity was worse than rage. He reached out, but his hand passed through her like smoke. When he blinked, she was gone. Jane Seymour came next, the pale saint. Her presence softened the room. She stood barefoot, her gown the color of morning mist, her hands folded gently across her chest. Her face, serene and luminous, reminded him of peace, that brief, fragile peace she had given him in the form of a son. Edward, the boy who had cost her life, the son for whom empires had fallen and women had burned. Jane did not speak. She did not need to. Her stillness was her message. Love without condition, faith without reward. She had died to give him everything he ever wanted, and yet, in the end, even that had not been enough. A tear slid down his cheek. It stung like confession. When he looked again, she had vanished into the dark. The fourth figure appeared not as a specter, but as a quiet reminder of survival. Anne of Cleves, the stranger bride, smiled faintly from the doorway. The king remembered their awkward meeting, his disgust, his insult. "She looks like a horse," he had said cruelly to his courtiers. Yet she, among them all, had lived. She had accepted her dismissal with grace, traded her crown for freedom, and outlived them all. She was not love. She was endurance proof that not every wound must end in blood. She gave a small, knowing nod. It was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement of all the women who had survived men like him. Then she, too, was gone. From the shadows stepped Catherine Howard, the Rose of Blood. Her youth struck him like a memory of sin. She was laughing, twirling in a gown of white satin stained with red. The girl who had danced too close to the fire. She had been a mirror of Anne, and he, too proud to see it, had crushed her beneath the same weight of suspicion. Her laughter turned to weeping. The sound filled the chamber like a child's cry. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, but for what? For loving her too little? For wanting her too much? The candlelight quivered. Her face faded. Only the echo of her sob remained. Finally came Catherine Parr, the widow and the word. She did not approach the bed. She stood by the dying fire, her face calm, her eyes steady, as though she had already forgiven what history never could. Of all of them, she had lived the longest. She had seen him broken, raging, terrified. And yet she had not flinched. She had prayed for him, debated him, challenged him, and survived. Her faith had not been in him, but in something greater. Now, she watched him as one might watch a dying star, magnificent once, pitiful now, yet still capable of light. When she turned to leave, her words echoed, though her lips did not move. "You prayed to be eternal, and so you are, but not as you wished." The room grew colder. The portraits on the wall seemed to breathe. The candle sputtered, then steadied once more. Henry lay motionless, his eyes open, his breath shallow. The visions had gone. Only the weight of their memory remained. 6 lives, intertwined with his, 6 mirrors reflecting the same man, the same sin. He realized then what none of his priests or princes could teach him, that a crown does not sanctify, and love does not absolve. That faith without mercy is only fire wearing the mask of heaven. He whispered something not to God, not to the dead, but to the silence itself. The candle flame wavered, then died. When the servants found him at dawn, the King of England lay still, his eyes fixed toward the window, where the first pale light of morning broke through. It touched the golden ring still clutched in his hand, the one he had worn since the day he wed Catherine of Aragon. No chuaid sang. No priest spoke. Only the wind moved through Whitehall, carrying the last whisper of a reign built on love and ashes. He conquered every heart except his own. And when the crown fell silent, England began to breathe again. The bells of Westminster tolled like thunder. Each strike carried not the sound of mourning but of rebirth. For after years of kings and regents, England once again bowed to a queen. Mary Tudor stood at the balcony of Whitehall, the autumn wind clawing through her crimson mantle. Below, the crowd roared, "God save the Queen!" But she heard only one voice, soft, accented, eternal, whispering from the grave, Catherine of Aragon. Her mother's ghost lived in every prayer Mary ever spoke, in every bead of her rosary, in every tear shed for a faith her father had torn apart. Now, the daughter of the wronged queen would restore what had been broken. She would bring England back to God, even if it burned. The court knelt before her, but the air was thick with unease. Too many had pledged to her father. Too many had cheered for Anne Boleyn. Mary saw them now, men who once called her a bastard, now calling her Majesty. Their smiles were made of smoke. Bishop Gardiner approached, his voice low, reverent. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing deeply, "the realm awaits your will. Shall we begin with Parliament, the act of supremacy?" Mary cut him off. "England has no supremacy but God's," she said, "and Rome shall be his voice again." The bishop nodded, a flicker of awe, or perhaps fear, in his eyes. The age of reform was over. The age of fire had begun. At night, Mary prayed alone. The chapel smelled of wax and old incense. She knelt before the crucifix, whispering the Latin prayers her mother had taught her as a child, words that had once sounded like comfort, now more like invocation. She prayed for her mother's soul. She prayed for her father's forgiveness. And, above all, she prayed for the heretics, the Protestants who had defied the Holy Church. "Let their souls be cleansed in flame," she murmured, "as gold is purified in the furnace." The candlelight wavered. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move, the faint shape of a woman in Spanish red, watching silently from the dark. Mary did not flinch. She whispered, "I will make you proud, Mother." The first fires were lit at Smithfield. The condemned stood bound to wooden stakes, their hands tied, their mouths dry with terror. The crowds gathered not out of hatred, but hunger for spectacle, for faith, for something to believe in after decades of lies. When the torches touched the kindling, the flames leapt like angels. The screams came next, human and holy, rising into the smoke-choked sky. Mary did not attend. She did not need to. Each soul burned was a prayer answered. Each cry, a hymn. Each death, an offering to the God her father had betrayed. They called her Mary the Pious, but soon they would call her Bloody Mary. In the royal chambers, Philip of Spain arrived, her husband, her foreign prince. He was younger, colder, his eyes like polished steel. To Mary, he was both husband and salvation, proof that God had not abandoned her womb, nor her purpose. But Philip did not love her. He endured her. He saw in her not beauty, but a bridge England, chained to the will of Spain. Mary, blind with devotion, mistook his distance for duty. When he left her for war, she wept as a bride might for a coffin. And when he did not return, she prayed harder, as though prayer could make a man faithful. The city burned again. This time, it was not the heretics but the conscience of England. Every pyre lit in London cast a shadow across her reign. Every flame devoured more than flesh. It consumed her mercy. The whispers grew. They called her cruel, mad, cursed. But she could not hear them over the memory of her mother's voice. "Do not yield, my daughter. God does not forget." So Mary did not yield. She doubled the burnings. Oxford, Canterbury, Winchester. The names became prayers. The prayers became smoke. Yet at night sleep betrayed her. She dreamed of fire, but not as a weapon, as a judge. In the dreams, the flames did not rise toward the sky. They turned inward, devouring her from within. Her hands blistered, her rosary melted, and through the roar of heat, she heard a single voice, her father's, whispering from the dark, "You and I are the same, daughter." She woke screaming, clutching her stomach, the belly that had once quickened with phantom life. She had believed she was with child. The physicians had confirmed it. The bells had been prepared. But the child never came. Her womb had betrayed her, just as her heart had. The Queen of England was barren, and the fires, once holy, now seemed hungry. One night, she summoned her confessor. Her voice trembled not with fear, but with fatigue. "Tell me," she asked, "how many souls have been saved?" The priest hesitated. He knew the true answer. "None." But he said softly, "As many as God wills, your Majesty." Mary turned to the window, watching the smoke rise over London. She whispered, "Then God must be very hungry." When Philip returned, she ran to him, frail, desperate, clinging to the illusion that love could still redeem her. But Philip's embrace was cold. He spoke of treaties, not tenderness, of heirs, not hearts. When he left again for Spain, he did not look back. Mary stood at the pier long after his ship had vanished into the mist. Her hands trembled. Her rosary slipped from her fingers, falling into the dark water below. The beads scattered a crown of faith, sinking beneath the Thames. In fire she sought purity. In love, redemption. In the end, she found neither, only silence and the echo of her mother's prayer. The year turned gray. Winter crept into London like a thief, stealing the warmth from every hearth. The air smelled of frost and soot, of burnt wood and unburied prayers. In the royal palace, behind veils of velvet and incense, the Queen lay dying. Mary Tudor was 38 years old, yet time had folded upon her like iron, bending her spine, draining her color, hollowing her eyes until they reflected nothing but flame. Her body was frail, but her faith remained sharp as the crown still resting near her bedside. It glimmered in the candlelight, a circle of gold forged by sin and sanctified by blood. She stared at it for hours, as though it might speak. Sometimes she thought it did. It whispered of duty. It whispered of vengeance. It whispered of her mother's voice, still echoing beneath the weight of England's guilt. The kingdom was restless. Crops failed. Storms raged. And the fires that once consumed heretics now consumed the streets. London's sky hung black with soot, as if heaven itself had turned its face away. Rumors slithered through the alleys of the Queen's illness, of her barren womb, of the Spanish king who would never return. They said she was cursed. They said her womb had been filled with ashes from the very pyres she had lit. And in the taverns, they whispered another name, a quiet name, but growing stronger with each passing day: Elizabeth. Mary heard it even in her prayers. It haunted her like a bell tolling for her own soul. At night, she dreamed again of her mother. Catherine of Aragon stood in a field of smoke, her veil fluttering like wings of flame. She spoke without sound, her lips forming words that Mary could not hear. And when the Queen reached for her, the vision dissolved into sparks, leaving only the smell of burning roses. Mary woke gasping, clutching her crucifix. She whispered the same prayer she had whispered since childhood: "Holy Mother, give me a sign." But heaven had fallen silent. The council begged her to name an heir. They knelt before her bed, faces masked with reverence but gleaming with fear. Some urged her to name Philip's cousin. Others whispered Elizabeth's name more boldly now, daughter of the heretic Anne Boleyn. Mary's heart recoiled at the thought. Elizabeth, the child of sin, the living proof of her father's betrayal, the girl whose mother's blood still stained the tower stones. And yet the only one left. For all her prayers, Mary had birthed no son, no savior, no future, only flame. She ordered Elizabeth to court. When the younger sister entered, Mary saw not the radiant youth of England's future, but the reflection of every ghost she had ever feared. Anne's eyes, Henry's arrogance, and something else, something colder, harder, carved from survival itself. The room chilled. The candles wavered. For a moment, Mary felt as if she were looking into her own coffin, and Elizabeth into her own mirror. The Queen's heart trembled, not with hate, but with exhaustion. She saw in Elizabeth not a rival, but the last ember of their cursed bloodline. And in that instant, for the first time, she felt pity. The days bled together. She could no longer walk without aid. Her lips bled when she prayed. Her confessor visited daily, recording her final wishes. She asked for her body to be buried beside her mother's, the Spanish queen, whose faith had once burned brighter than the English Sunday. But she made one final command. England must never again betray the true church. History, as always, had other plans. Outside her window, the people had grown silent. No cheers, no hymns, only the sound of wind through the dying trees of Whitehall Gardens. Mary watched the leaves fall red, gold, black like the robes of martyrs descending into dust. The smoke from the chimneys rose toward the heavens, just as it had from the pyres, and for a moment she wondered whether she had mistaken fire for light. Her death came quietly, not with the roar of faith, but with the sigh of surrender. She lay surrounded by priests, their chants murmuring like waves on a distant shore. The crucifix slipped from her hand. Her last breath carried a whisper, a prayer, half Spanish, half English, the voice of two worlds she had never reconciled. Madre, perdón. And then, silence. Across the city, church bells rang once more, not for triumph, but for transition. The daughter of Aragon was gone. And before her body cooled, the council crowned another, Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman her father had killed and her sister had cursed. The wheel had turned once more. London awoke to sunlight for the first time in years. The sky, long blackened by smoke, opened like a wound healing. The pyres were extinguished. The crosses were polished anew, and from the ashes of fire, England was reborn not in faith, but in silence. In that silence, the people whispered a name, Mary. They did not curse her. They did not bless her. They only remembered her face pale, stern, almost holy. A woman who had loved too fiercely, prayed too deeply, and burned too much. Centuries later, the bells of Westminster still echo her story. Tourists walk the stones where she once stood, never hearing the whispers buried beneath. But if one listens closely, if one stands in the chapel at dusk, they might still smell smoke. And in that faint, ghostly scent, one might remember, she burned to cleanse the world, and only cleansed herself from history. Dawn broke over England like a confession. After years of smoke and silence, the light seemed too pure, too honest, washing away the soot from 1,000 chimneys, peeling the sorrow from the city's stone. The bells that had tolled for Mary now sang a different song. It was not mourning, but awakening. From the high towers of Westminster to the grey waters of the Thames, London exhaled. The fires were gone. The air was clean. And in that stillness, the people spoke a name they had once dared only whisper. Elizabeth. She arrived at the palace under a pale winter Sunday. The streets were lined not with soldiers, but with silence, a silence so thick it seemed holy. Her carriage rolled through puddles of melted frost, reflecting the shadow of a new crown. Behind her, the ghosts followed her father's shadow, her mother's smile, her sister's ashes. Ahead of her, a throne that devoured all who dared touch it. Elizabeth stepped out, her breath visible in the cold. She looked at the palace, her father's house, her sister's tomb, her nation's wound. In its windows, she saw a reflection not of triumph, but of burden. The air around her seemed to whisper what history already knew. She was not born to rule. She was born to survive. Inside, the great hall smelled of wax and iron. Banners hung heavy from the rafters, red for blood, gold for glory. The throne sat waiting, untouched, since the queen before her had fallen into darkness. Every noble eye in the room watched her, some with hope, others with fear. and more with quiet calculation. Elizabeth moved with the poise of someone who had spent her life studying danger. Each step was deliberate. Each breath was armor. The crown glimmered on the cushion, the same one that had rested on Henry's brow, then Catherine's, then Mary's. It was no longer gold. It was rusted history. When she lifted it, the candles trembled. The hall seemed to draw its breath. And as the metal touched her head, the weight of 6 ghosts settled on her shoulders. The kingdom began to change. Where Mary had built pyres, Elizabeth built schools. Where her father had torn down monasteries, she built walls of language and reason. England's hunger for power, for stability, for a God it could trust, found a new form in her calm, calculating grace. But peace is never pure. It is made from sacrifice, from cold choices whispered in the dark. Elizabeth learned quickly that mercy could be as dangerous as wrath. She ruled not by heart, but by mask. Every glance, every gesture, every silence was a move on a board carved from bone. Her court glittered poets, courtiers, spies, traitors dressed as lovers. The air was thick with perfume and lies. They called her the Virgin Queen, as if purity could make her holy, as if solitude could make her safe. In truth, she was neither. She was England itself, desired, feared, untouchable, burning quietly beneath the surface. Beyond her palace walls, the world shifted. The sea became England's new cathedral. Ships rose like prayers, wooden giants painted with crosses and ambition. They carried her banners into the wind, her name whispered across oceans that had never known such command. Spain called her heretic. France called her witch. But her people called her mother. Each morning, she walked the galleries of Whitehall alone. The portraits of her family lined the walls. Henry, vast and defiant. Anne Boleyn, delicate and doomed. Mary, solemn in her crimson gown. Elizabeth would pause before each one, her eyes steady, her lips unreadable. Beneath her calm exterior, a single question echoed through her mind, the same question that haunted her bloodline for generations. Was it worth the crown? In the quiet of night, the palace would sleep. But Elizabeth never did. The candles burned until dawn, their wax spilling like time itself across her desk. Maps, letters, decrees, all stained with ink, some with tears she never admitted were hers. Her father had ruled with the body brute force, hunger, will. Her mother had ruled with the heart charm, wit, defiance. She ruled with neither. Her kingdom was her skin. Her solitude was her weapon. The suitors came princes, dukes, kings from foreign lands, each bearing gifts, alliances, and veiled threats. But none stayed. She wore her refusal like armor, each no, another link in a chain of freedom. She was not to be possessed. Not again. Not by any man, any church, or any god. And yet, even the strongest armor rusts. There were nights when she stood by the window, watching the moon sink behind the city. Her reflection stared back, pale, regal, unyielding. But behind her eyes flickered a sorrow she never named. The sorrow of being both woman and monument, both daughter and destiny. In the dark, she thought of her mother, the woman they called witch, adulteress, traitor, and yet whose blood had built this golden age. Anne Boleyn had been burned in whispers, but her daughter now ruled the world. It was a strange inheritance power born from shame, peace born from execution. Elizabeth carried it all in silence, for in the kingdom of men, silence was the only crown that never slipped. As years passed, the realm flourished. The language of Shakespeare bloomed. The navy grew vast and terrible. England became something new, not just a nation, but an idea. Yet beneath the triumph, Elizabeth's heart grew colder. Every victory cost her a piece of herself. Every betrayal carved another line into her soul. Her courtiers called her immortal. The poets called her divine. But when the torches dimmed and the halls emptied, she was only a woman sitting before a mirror, touching the edge of her crown, wondering what it had taken to keep it shining. The crown had begun with her father's hunger, passed through her mother's ruin, through her sister's flames. Now it rested on her, gleaming brighter than ever, but it no longer felt like salvation. It felt like inheritance, a curse carried in gold. And in that truth, the Virgin Queen smiled, for she understood what none before her had. To rule was to bleed quietly, beautifully, endlessly. The years gathered like dust upon her throne. Time, once her ally, had become her shadow, a presence she could neither command nor deny. The mirrors of Whitehall, once kind, now told her truths she refused to speak. Her hair, once gold as dawn, paled into the color of ash. Her skin, painted by candlelight, could no longer hide the slow retreat of youth. But the eyes, those fierce, unflinching eyes, still held the fire of 1,000 crowns. They were her true armor. They kept the courtiers trembling, the ambassadors cautious, the poets worshipful. In their reflection, they saw not a woman, but a nation staring back. Her reign had become a golden theater. Pageants, masks, triumphs, all designed to feed the legend. The courtiers danced, the poets wrote, the people cheered, and Elizabeth stood at the center of it all, radiant yet untouchable, the Virgin Queen whose love belonged only to England. Every gesture she made was measured, every smile rehearsed. Her existence became performance not out of vanity, but survival. She had learned from her mother that beauty could be a weapon, from her father that fear could build a throne. She wove both into her reign, until even the truth bowed to her illusion. The kingdom prospered. Ships returned from unknown worlds with gold, silk, and rumors of paradise. The new world spoke her name, whispered by sailors in distant ports. Painters immortalized her in jewels and white lace, an image of divine perfection untouched by sin or sorrow. But beneath the paint, her body ached. Beneath the crown, her mind never rested. She knew what the portraits hid, that the Virgin Queen was only flesh, and flesh must fail. Sometimes, late in the night, she walked through the deserted halls of her palace, past the echoing footsteps of memory. Each room bore a ghost. Here, her father had roared his decrees. There, her mother had laughed before the fall. Every corner was a confession carved in stone. Outside, the wind sang through the gardens a hollow, mournful hymn. The roses bloomed too red, the moon hung too low. Even nature seemed to know it was serving its final queen. Across the channel, Spain prepared its vengeance. The great armada gathered sails black with holy intent, cannons glinting like divine punishment. The Pope called her heretic, Jezebel, the whore of Babylon. But Elizabeth, standing upon the cliffs of Tilbury in her armor of silver and silk, felt no fear. She had lived her life in fire. Now she would meet it again. The wind turned a storm from the north. The sea rose and tore the Spanish ships apart, scattering them like prayers unanswered. The storm saved England, and the people said it was her will that moved the heavens. Yet even victory tasted hollow. The glory that surrounded her was bought with silence, with solitude. The men who had loved her were dead, betrayed, or banished. The ones who replaced them looked at her not with passion, but with reverence and fear. She began to fade from herself. The mask grew heavier. The crown, once her greatest triumph, became her cage. The court still celebrated, but she had stopped attending the feasts. The laughter felt wrong, the music too loud, the faces too young. In her private chamber, she sat before a mirror draped with black cloth, her reflection flickering in the candlelight. Around her, portraits of her younger self stared from the walls, eternal, smiling, perfect. She looked at them, and for the first time, she did not recognize the woman they portrayed. The poets still praised her. The nation still adored her. But the Virgin Queen had become more myth than mortal. Even her own heart no longer belonged to her. Her counselors whispered of succession, of heirs, of the future. She had none. No husband, no child, No dynasty, only an empire born from her will and destined to outlive her flesh. But perhaps that was her design all along, to end the curse that had begun with her father's desire for sons, to prove that a woman could build eternity without giving birth to it. As winter came, the queen withdrew into silence. The court waited outside her doors, unsure whether to hope or pray. The candles within burned low, their light trembling across her pale face. She had stopped eating, stopped speaking, as though every word now cost her another heartbeat. Her ladies watched helplessly as she sat upon a pile of cushions, crown abandoned beside her, staring into nothing. She thought of her mother's execution, the blade flashing in sunlight, the crowd holding its breath. She thought of her father's death, swollen, bitter, haunted by ghosts. She thought of her sister's fire, the screams that rose like hymns. And she wondered what history would make of her own silence. Outside, the bells began to toll again, slow, solemn, endless. Not yet for her, but soon. The realm that had once feared her now feared her passing. What would remain when her light went out? What would England become without its virgin flame? She closed her eyes. The room seemed to drift away, its walls dissolving into mist. The air thickened with memory, Anne's whisper, Henry's roar, Mary's tears. They were all there, waiting for her, their shadows reaching across time. In that final stillness, Elizabeth smiled, for she understood what none before her had. To rule is to die slowly and to be remembered forever. When dawn came, the crown rested upon the altar, cold and unclaimed. The courtiers knelt in silence, their tears falling onto marble that had seen too much grief. Outside, the people wept not for the queen they had lost, but for the age that would never return. The Virgin Queen was gone, but her echo remained. In every ship that sailed, in every verse written, in every act of courage that bore her name. Her father had conquered bodies, her mother had conquered hearts, Elizabeth had conquered time. And so history closed its book not with fire, not with blood, but with silence. The throne room was empty. For the first time in more than a century, no monarch's shadow stretched across its floor. The candles had burned themselves to wax and smoke. The banners hung limp, their colors faded like breath on glass. Outside, London slept beneath a sky the color of iron. The river moved sluggishly, carrying the cold memory of empires downstream. The great Tudor dynasty was over. Henry's blood, the blood for which kingdoms had bled and queens had died, had run its course. There were no sons, no heirs, no one left to bear his name. Only silence remained, vast and absolute, like the pause after a prayer that will never be answered. The courtiers moved through the corridors, like mourners in a cathedral. Their whispers echoed, uncertain, afraid. For decades they had lived beneath the command of voices that thundered like divine law, Henry's rage, Mary's fire, Elizabeth's iron will. Now there was only the sound of their own breathing. On the high walls, portraits watched them, Henry's cruel eyes, Anne's sly smile, Catherine's dignity frozen in oil and dust. They seemed alive in the flickering light, as if the souls of the dead refused to leave the palace that had consumed them. In the chapel, the crown lay on black velvet, gold dulled, jewels dimmed, a relic of mortal glory. The priests sang, but even their voices seemed unsure, fading into the stone. A shaft of light fell through the stained glass, illuminating the crown like a wound. It was heavy, even in stillness, forged in love, worn in sin, passed through fire and blood, and now abandoned. The symbol of God's will on earth had outlived the flesh that once justified it. The people gathered outside Whitehall. They did not riot. They did not cheer. They only waited, as though waiting might wake the dead. Old women crossed themselves. Children clung to their mothers. Merchants stood with hats in hand, unsure whether they were mourning a queen, an age, or their own small place in the turning of history. Above them, the palace loomed vast, silent, and tired. Every stone seemed to exhale the ghosts of the 6 women who had walked its halls and met their fates within its walls. Catherine's faith, Anne's defiance, Jane's quiet grace, Anne of Cleves' laughter, Catherine Howard's youth, Catherine Parr's wisdom, 6 prayers, 6 sacrifices, 6 fragments of the same wound. In the private chambers where Elizabeth had died, the air still held her scent, wax, ink, and rosewater. Her writing table was untouched, quill poised above the last unfinished letter. The ink had dried mid-thought, the final word fading into nothing. Behind the desk stood a mirror, veiled in black. No one dared uncover it, for they believed her reflection still lingered there, caught between the glass and eternity. That night, the palace dreamt. The corridors filled with footsteps that had no bodies. The tapestries rustled though no wind blew. The great doors of the chapel opened on their own, and the candles flared as though lit by invisible hands. If one listened closely, one could almost hear the whisper of 6 voices, not in pain, not in anger, but in remembrance. Catherine of Aragon praying for the soul of the man who cast her aside. Anne Boleyn laughing beneath the echo of the blade. Jane Seymour murmuring lullabies for a son who would never live to see peace. Anne of Cleves humming a tune of freedom, the only one who escaped unscarred. Catherine Howard weeping softly for youth spent and stolen. Catherine Parr whispering verses of mercy for them all. They came not to haunt, but to finish the story. Some said they were seen walking through the hall that night, 6 figures robed in light, carrying candles that never burned down. They stopped before the empty throne, their faces neither living nor dead, only eternal. The first candle flickered Catherine's, and the light touched the carved lions on the dais. The second, Anne's, burned blue, cold as steel. Then Jane's, warm and trembling. Anne of Cleves' flame bowed like a curtsy. Catherine Howard's sputtered, restless. Catherine Parr's rose steady and strong, illuminating them all. Together, their light wove a single reflection across the golden seat, the face of Henry, not as king, but as man. The man who had broken the world to make himself divine, only to be swallowed by his own creation. For an instant, the candles flared, and then, one by one, went out. Darkness reclaimed the throne. By morning, the ghosts were gone. Only a faint scent of smoke remained, mingling with the dawn air. In the chapel, the crown still lay untouched. But beside it, no one knew how it came to be, was a single white rose dew still clinging to its petals. No one dared move it. The servants crossed themselves. The guards avoided the gaze of the altar. Even the chaplain refused to speak the obvious truth, that some stories end not in death, but in quiet forgiveness. The council met to discuss succession. Foreign princes, distant cousins, rival claims, names, and titles tossed across the table like dice. But none of them carried the fire that once defined England. The age of passion had ended. The age of consequence had begun. The throne would not know love again. It would know only duty, a colder god than any Henry ever served. Outside, the river moved on. The bells of London tolled again, this time not in mourning, but in acknowledgement, a requiem for an empire built on vows and blood. The people went back to their trades, their prayers, their lives. But in the back of every mind lingered the same uneasy truth. The Tudors had ruled like gods and perished like mortals. The silence left behind was not peace. It was memory, heavy and unending, echoing through the stones of England itself. Night again. The city sleeps, but the palace still breathes slow, heavy, like a creature too ancient to die. In the great hall, the tapestries ripple, though no wind stirs. The woven scenes of triumph, coronations, marriages, battles shimmer faintly in the dim light. Each thread holds the echo of a life unspooled too quickly. The court painters had tried to immortalize the Tudors, to trap their beauty in pigment and oil. But time has begun to eat the colors, turning flesh into shadow, jewels into dust. Even glory rots when no one remembers what it cost. In the upper gallery, a single candle burns beside the portrait of Henry. It has burned there since the day of his death, replaced each night by trembling hands that no longer recall why. The king's painted face watches everything: the rise and fall of empires, the footsteps of strangers who dare walk his halls. His eyes, cold, calculating, are almost alive, as though the man within the frame waits to be judged. And perhaps he is. For beneath the floor of the chapel lies his tomb, black marble veined with white, built to hold him and his third wife, Jane Seymour. But Jane's body rests elsewhere, lost to the shifting earth, and Henry lies alone beneath a slab that bears no prayer, only his name, Henry Rex. Nothing more. Sometimes the guards whisper that they hear him, a heavy step in the dark, the slow drag of breath, thick with pain and memory, the echo of iron boots pacing before the altar, as if the old king still cannot rest. And maybe he cannot. For how can a man who broke heaven and earth for love ever sleep in peace? Centurius pas lexis. Kings and queens come and go, some beloved, some despised, all eventually forgotten. But the legend of Henry remains, reshaped by each generation: tyrant, reformer, sinner, saint. His wives reduced to lessons in obedience or cautionary tales for the ambitious. Yet beneath the myths, beneath the portraits and hymns and lies, something truer endures. A quiet ache, the pulse of human ruin that built a golden age on broken hearts. Once a year, when the church bells toll for the Feast of Saints, the wind that moves through Westminster seems to carry voices. They rise softly, woven together like a prayer. Not pleading, not condemning, remembering Catherine of Aragon, the steadfast queen whose faith outlasted kings; Anne Boleyn, the fire that turned love into heresy; Jane Seymour, the ghost mother of a son who never grew old; Anne of Cleves, the stranger who learned that freedom can wear a smile; Catherine Howard, the child crushed beneath desire; Catherine Parr, the scholar who outlived her cage. Each voice threads through the other, forming a single song, a requiem for the man who made them all one story. If you could stand in that chapel now, you would see how the dawn light falls upon the tomb, a pale beam piercing through stained glass, bathing the marble in crimson and gold. The light does not judge. It only reveals the carvings of cherubs, the Latin script long eroded, the cracks running like veins through the stone, and for a heartbeat, the reflection of 6 faint figures in the light. 6 queens, watching, not in vengeance, not in pity, simply in truth. The story ends here, not with blood, but with silence. A silence that speaks louder than war, because it holds everything that words could not save. The silence of Catherine's faith when her prayers went unanswered. The silence of Anne's last breath as steel met flesh. The silence of Jane's smile as her son was placed in her arms. The silence of Anne of Cleves' laughter, echoing down the corridor as she left. The silence of Catherine Howard's tears, when she realized what love had cost. The silence of Catherine Parr's final prayer for them all. And the silence of Henry himself, the king who sought eternity through them and found only his name carved into cold stone. As the centuries fade, the legend survives. Tourists come and go, whispering in the chapel where the candles burn low. Some swear the air feels heavier there, as if the weight of history presses on the chest, a quiet reminder that power is never clean and love never safe. A child asks her mother, who lies beneath the stone. The mother hesitates, then whispers, "A king," but she does not say the rest, that the true story lies not with him, but with the 6 women whose lives built his heaven and his hell. The camera would linger there. On the tomb, on the fading rose, someone has placed at its base. On the way, light trembles across the inscription. Then, slowly, the frame would pull back, up through the chapel's vast arches, through the mist rising from the Thames, through the clouds that swallow the city whole. until the world is nothing but gray sky and faint candlelight. They said he had 6 wives, but it was the same woman, over and over: faith, fire, hope, fear, defiance, and silence, each reborn until the last candle went out. He broke a church for love, and 6 women paid the price. This was not the story of a king. It was the story of the crown itself, how it devours, how it forgives, and how it remembers. If history has taught us anything, it's that power always comes with a prayer and a grave. Like, share, and subscribe. Not for the glory of kings, but for the memory of the women who stood before them.